All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Robert Leach. I work for the Civil Military Innovation Institute, and I want to welcome everyone for coming out, for dialing in to the CMI2 first sponsored Tactical Realities of War Innovation in Ukraine speaker series. We wanted to get everyone together to kind of talk about some of the work that we do with Civil Military Innovation Institute. We want to talk about the changing nature, changing technologies that are being implemented in combat. We want to get people's heads wrapped around the rapid pace of the evolution. So our agenda for this morning, sorry for the late delay. For those who are dialed in out there, we're at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. That's having a traditional spring storm, and the 101st is doing their Week of the Eagle division run. So glad we're inside, but it's delayed everybody coming in. So we tried to push it as long as we can, but we're going to go ahead and get moving for the sake of everybody and the sake of time. Our agenda on here today, we'll kind of push things around a little bit, but I'll do the intro discussion a little bit on why we're here and why we're talking about this. I want to move up and go straight to Dr. Leo Blanken to talk about military innovation and his work at Naval Postgraduate School. Then we'll move on. We have Major General retired Mick Ryan. He's going to be dialing in to talk about his work and what he's seen in Ukraine and the new tactical realities, the new equipment, the new technologies, and how they're using them on both sides of the conflict. We'll take a lunch break for those here. We'll be over at the Eagle Works building hosting. And then after that, we have Mr. August Cole, was gracious enough to come in the house today. He's going to talk fictional intelligence, kind of future combat, future war. And then we'll finish it up with an overview of the Catalyst Pathfinder program for those who aren't aware of how we work and some of the work we're doing in the tactical innovation space. So first, again, thank you all for dialing in. Thank you for coming. And to start, looking at, why this matters. Why do we need to have these type of conversations? What brings us to the point of, those that are intellectually curious about the changes that are happening in the world today with technology. And we see, on our social media, we see on our feeds how fast and the new technologies that are being employed in ongoing conflicts. We see how the face of combat's changing rapidly. We see the traditional norms that we know as the modus operandi, if you will, of how we do combat. We see it kind of being upended in conflicts across the globe. We see drones filling the skies of Ukraine, paragliding terrorists redefining the concept of surprise attacks. We have signal masking becoming just as crucial, if not more, than cover and concealment. We hear tanks and armor are obsolete. We hear tanks and armor are the future. We see innovations like robot dogs with flamethrowers being highlighted as the next great thing. We have mothership drones carrying swarms of first-person view, one-way attack UAS, long distances across traditional stability and lines. We have large language models that are advancing quicker than any of us can keep up with. The new model of ChatGPT came out. If you haven't seen that one yet, gave me a pep talk on my way in this morning, and I didn't even ask it to, which was weird. It's clear for those of us that are paying attention that the future of warfare is evolving and arriving faster than most of us are able to keep pace with. We see innovations overseas that take months to be employed and developed, and on our timelines would take years for integration and development. So seeing all that as we navigate that landscape, having conversations like this, exploring what's happening, coming up with those good ideas that we can take back to our leadership, coming up with those good ideas that we can build into the new prototypes, the new technologies that we need. It's crucial that we stay ahead of that curve of change. and we harness those new technologies to shape our future of combat and avoid being shaped by it. As you watch social media and you see the images of wars over in Ukraine, the images of the wars in Gaza, you see the evolution of things coming before us. And when you get to work that day, you sit down, you turn off the feed of the drones chasing, Ukrainian drones chasing Russian soldiers around tanks, and you go back to answering your emails, and you go back to planning your, 2-year timeline for how you're going to accomplish your mission essential task list. You look at your budget, and you feel that pull of the cognitive dissonance that says we're not maybe matching in here in training what's happening overseas. So what change and how do you implement it is kind of the question, because change for change's sake is not where we want to be. You have to know kind of where we're going in order to push that ship in the right direction. Walking with blinders as opposed to just carrying out your 1-2 year time in your seat and not paying attention to the changes is equally as dangerous. So innovation, it's on the slides. It's in the name of the company I work for. It's the one buzzword to rule them all. We've all heard it. We have innovation think tanks. We have innovation meetings. We have innovation officers. We have innovation boot camps. We have innovation this and that. But understanding what innovation is, and probably more importantly what it isn't, and how to use it at your level in order to actually make the changes is what we're all striving for here in this organization, and what probably most of you out there are looking at if you're interested in this type of reality and this type of talk. So today, along that vein, we're going to discuss military innovation, how to harness it, how to capitalize on opportunities and discover ways to grab a hold of that change that we need to stay abreast of the differences that we see overseas. We're going to discuss ongoing conflicts with a focus on Ukraine. We're going to discuss how Russia and Ukraine both are using new technologies and not keep it one-sided. We're going to talk about the ways to harness your own creative ambitions, your own creative mindsets, and fictional realization to materialize that future fight into something tangible that we can all see and understand. The challenge of innovation is to merge understanding of new threats, incorporate new technology, and challenge the status quo of established norms. Now, I know that's easier said than done when we all work for the largest employer in the world. I think as of 2022, the DoD was somewhere around 3 million people with active duty reserves, National Guard, civilian employees. So an organization that large is naturally going to be resistant to change, and that's not always a bad thing. You can't change every system and norm that we do because managing an organization that large requires some of these systems. But finding ways to work around the systems that hinder change, that hinder the change we need on the tactical application side, is the task that we kind of put forth to you all. So with that in mind, the balance has to be sought. Combat is evolving, it's changing, it's morphing in front of our eyes with the incorporation of new and emergent technologies that can and are causing disruptions on massive scales. Past successes in the arena of warfighting do not ensure victories in the future. Economies of scale, such as the Department of Defense, the United States Army, and all of its components, do not ensure victory. Innovation and new technology can disrupt large organizations and cause failures where previously there was great success. Today, we're here to explore the current nuances of ongoing war in order to better understand where we need to seek out those changes necessary to stay at the cutting edge of battle and stay on that edge of chaos. So since we started a little bit late today, I'm going to go forward into one more slide, and then I'll start pushing over to the speakers. And I think this will hopefully help to speed the conversation along for the end of the day. So the 4 pillars of tactical innovation is a concept I came up with as focus with this, our efforts with the Civil Military Innovation Institute. So tactical innovation is a subset of the broader military innovation nexus. It occurs at the crossroads of battlefield understanding, discipline, creativity, and it's accomplished through these 4 key pillars that help prop up the concepts of change that we've been discussing. So first, the concept of tactical innovation can't occur without the tactical level nuance. It occurs and begins with the tactical level leaders, the tactical level soldiers, that ground level ideation that is seen from day-to-day practitioners, day-to-day operators on the ground. Those key leaders, those tactical leaders are the key brokers of thought and understanding of what current tactics exist and how they employ them. They understand what current technologies they're using. They understand what works and what doesn't work, and they understand how things need to change. So when you take that tactical level unit, that tactical level leader who's proficient in their task day to day, and you give them the understanding of what new capabilities and technologies are happening on the front of the new fight or fights that are happening overseas, you can see where the ideas can come out, and they can say, hey, if we were put into the situation tomorrow, if the 101st was deployed to go fight in combat tomorrow in the same scenario that you see in Ukraine right now, where would they fall short, and how do they maximize their time now to prepare for that next fight? We, almost as a rule, are creatures of habit and structure. So forcing change and forcing these new ideas out of the tactical leaders and pushing them out of their comfort zone, if you will, of, I have 1 year to meet these tasks that I have to accomplish. I have to get green on my mission essential tasks. When you do the same normal type of training pipelines over and over again, you get proficient in what you're told to be proficient in, but you're not pushing the envelope on understanding where those new innovations can arise. So looking at where the nexus of that new true that we're understanding, that we're seeing overseas, and incorporating some of that stuff into your daily training, your team, your squad, your platoon, live fires, allows for those new ideas to kind of rise to the surface on their own. The second pillar in the tactical innovation is the enablement of rapid prototyping and development. So I know everyone in here has the ability to go ahead and fund all these ideas that they have in their mind. So feel free to start developing your own concepts. I'm kidding, but the rapid prototyping and actually building of these innovations into actual physical, tangible items is the part that's usually missing kind of across the board. So Catalyst Pathfinder, and we're going to talk more in detail about that later, kind of gives the ability for those tactical ideas to come to fruition through research and development dollars, through organizations like EagleWorks next door, through some of our organizations at other key military bases. We're able to take those ideas, work with the soldier, and build those prototypes as fast as we can to get them back out there and get them for testing and evaluation, get them proofed, get them solidified into something that can get, turned into program of record or turned into a purchasable item for the unit, or get as many out there in the hands as we can so they can get out and test them and challenge their ideas that they came up with. Third on the list of the pillars is the integration of new technologies with tactics. This is something that I've seen multiple times, and most of you probably have as well. You get a new piece of gear, you get a new piece of equipment, it's dedicated, or it's dictated down to you that you have to use it, you have to bring it in, and you take it, you try it out, you don't like it, you throw it in the locker, you throw it in the back of the arms room, and you never touch it again. A lot of that, admittedly is because the stuff that you're handed down to you probably was a good idea about 3 or 4 years ago, and it just finally came to. But taking those technologies and integrating them into your training pipeline as a rule, as opposed to something that you feel is a task, is something that can drive even greater changes within your formations. One of the events that we host with Civil Military Innovation Institute is our Dirt Days training events out in West Virginia. We bring out new technologies and we let units who are going to be conducting their standard tasks, their standard training, kind of integrate them in and see how they would use them and see how they like them. And we've seen everything from units take this new technology and they just kind of carry it on their backpack, and then they get done. They're like, yeah, it was great. It was heavy. We didn't like it. And we've seen the real powerful, or the more powerful outcomes is when, that platoon from the 101st, instead of just sticking whatever it is in the middle of their formation while they're walking, change their whole tactic, change their whole formation while they're walking, come up with a brand new tactical employment of their force based off of this new technology. The final pillar, and I'll pass this on to what we're all here for today, but the final pillar of tactical innovation isn't tactical at all. It's operational, it's strategic, it's a series of, an operation is a series of tactics synchronized in time and space. So whenever you have, if you're following along with the pillar formula or format, and you've now come up with these new divergent tactics based off these new technologies that you've integrated or created, the next logical step is to come up with new operational constructs that are going to be really divergent and change kind of the nature of the way you do things. When the tactics mentioned in the third pillar change, so if you're, your 101st element and you change the way you do your platoon maneuver based off of these new technologies, based off of that robot dog with the flamethrower that you're now walking around on a leash in your formation, that's going to create a new operational construct, a new disruptive operational construct. This is the hard change, but these are the changes, the truly strategic level changes that can make a difference on the battlefield and see the enemy caught unaware of what you've been preparing. So the 4 pillars are something that I've just seen on my day-to-day when I was, active duty before I retired, and kind of fostered in the back of the head on how we should be evolving. Coming to work with the Civil Military Innovation Institute, was able to take it a step further and actually see it in action and see how it can work and how it works when units really embrace the change that I was discussing earlier. Whenever they embrace that new technology and come up with a new tactical way of employing that technology. And then, it can work vice versa, essentially, where you can come up with that divergent operational construct that you want to do. And if you say, if I were put into Ukraine tomorrow as an ODA or as a platoon, I would want to try this. I think this would work. I think this would get me past all the things I'm seeing Ukraine fail do. You now come up with that operational construct, and you can work your way backwards down the pillars of developing those new tactics that would fill the need for the operational construct, and you develop those new technologies that make that happen. So that's it. I'm going to quit running my yap up here, and for everybody who's here, wants to hear the speakers that came in today. I thank you, everyone who's been able to come, all those who are dialed in on the outstations. If you give me 1 second, I will switch off, and we're going to get into Dr. Leo Blanken from the Naval Postgraduate School. So Dr. Leo Blanken is an associate professor in the Defense Analysis Department at the Naval Postgraduate School and the academic lead for the Applied Design for Innovation Master's curriculum. He has published articles on innovation, irregular warfare, strategic competition, defense, and defense economics. He is the author of Rational Empires, Institutional Incentives, and Imperial Expansion, and co-editor of Assessing War, The Challenge of Measuring Success and Failure. He's also collects and DJs rare soul and funk records from the 1960s. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Leo Blanken.
Just click off that.
Yep.
Super. So thanks everyone for showing up on a rainy Friday. Thanks to folks on the outstations. Thanks to CMI2, and especially thanks to Rob for having me out here. First off, everything I say today are my own views and do not represent policy or position of the U.S. government. So if you can survive me, this is definitely going to be the most boring talk, and you can make it to Mick Ryan and August Cole's talk. That'll be great for you. I'm actually going to spend a fair amount of time today talking about the Cold War, which is maybe not what you signed up for, but talking about questions of military innovation today and the challenges of military innovation today is predicated on the status quo of what we, as the United States, are inheriting from our existing systems of innovation and transformation. So understanding that context, I think, will be critical to then hear from, let's say, Mick Ryan and August Cole about things that are going on in Ukraine and how those might lead to transformation or innovation in the U.S. military. Yep. So what I'm going to talk about today is the Cold War, the global war on terror, and what I'm going to synthesize from those experiences is what I'm going to call the lighthouse model of innovation. And then we're going to talk about current challenges to U.S. national security, and I'll be proposing this thing that I call the Christmas tree model of innovation. So once again, trying to set the stage here with this status quo lighthouse model, which we are currently seeing strains and deficiencies in our inherited lighthouse model of innovation. And then I propose a way forward with this Christmas tree model. So let's talk about the Cold War. The United States emerged from World War II having learned a lot of lessons about national security. And one lesson that they learned from World War II is the need for innovation to be a steady state set of organizations and processes to constantly update military forces for a changing strategic and operational environment. That you could no longer rely on random strokes of brilliance to get new technology, get new capabilities, get new ways of doing things. That you had to bake into the cake processes to constantly innovate. And it's what Martin van Creveld calls, it's the invention of invention. That putting as one of your core tasks of your organization is to constantly strive for innovation. So this was a big lesson from World War II. As the United States comes out of World War II and starts into the Cold War, understanding that this was going to be a contestation of innovation, right? So let's think about the Cold War challenge. The Soviet Union was a big deal, right? It was seen as really an existential threat to the United States. So the Soviet Union was a problem in some ways, a difficult problem, a large problem in some ways, but it also represented an actually simple problem in other ways. So let's think about what the Soviet Union was vis-a-vis the United States. Well, both of them were great powers, both of them seeking global hegemony, both of them having come out of World War II with largely parallel sets of military forces built around armored divisions and fighter planes and bombers and submarines. So the force structure of the Soviet Union was a mirror image of our own in a lot of ways. The prioritization of the Soviets as the key threat to the United States was unquestioned. All other concerns were secondary to that at best. And not only that, but the Soviet Union as a threat, its threat was crystallized in a single operational challenge, which became the Fulda Gap. The problem of the fact that the Soviets had a huge amount of mass that they could invade Western Europe with, and how we could, short of nuclear war, prevent that from happening became the key operational problem. So the nice thing about the Soviet Union during the Cold War, even though they were a big problem, they were a relatively stable and slow-moving target for innovation challenges. And this ended up being really nice for the United States. So what did the United States have to bring to bear to enable innovation against the Soviet Union? Well, the United States had a lot of money. The DoD spent a lot of money on this. So in 1960, every dollar that was spent on planet Earth for research and development in 1960, for every dollar that was spent on R&D anywhere on planet Earth in 1960, 36 cents of that dollar was spent by the Department of Defense. So the US DoD spent over a third of all money spent on R&D in 1960. So this is a really powerful tool to lay against these innovation challenges to plan against the Soviet Union. So the Soviets' threat was something that was really well understood, and the fact that the United States could use money to control, to a large degree, the technology and the applications of technology that would be applied against those innovation challenges. So what did the United States, using that huge amount of money that 36% of all global R&D spending represented, like moths to a flame, the United States could mobilize everything from basic science to applied science to engineering to development to design to implementation, etc. The United States could use this money to mobilize land-grant universities, UARCs, FFRDCs, service labs, national labs, and most importantly, during the Cold War, the United States had a vibrant and competitive defense sector. So could mobilize competition in an active market of defense firms, mobilize all of these assets to apply against these problems, which were really well understood given the structure of the Soviet threat. And so what did the United States create? Was essentially a lighthouse, this lighthouse model. So if you look at this lighthouse, the top of the lighthouse, this beam of light represents this single focused look at the problem set, and then that light is built on top of this tall vertical structure. So the United States built this lighthouse model of innovation, which was hierarchical, highly centralized, and characterized by this hyperdivision of labor. And so when we think of this model, what did it produce for us? What did it produce for the nation during the Cold War? And we can focus on the Army here since this is an Army audience. So if you think about by the 70s, and into the 80s, the things that this had succeeded in doing was developing airland battle doctrine. To enable airland battle doctrine, developing these really interesting technologies, which we now kind of refer to as the second offset, so stealth technology, precision-guided munitions, sensors. It also allowed the Army, with the establishment of Training and Doctrine Command, to link doctrine, training, concepts of employment, etc., to weapon systems that they needed to accomplish these goals. And so the Army succeeds in developing the Big Five programs: the Abrams, the Bradley, the Patriot, the Black Hawk, the Apache, these systems. So you have doctrine, you have concepts, you have improvements on weapon systems, tanks, armored personnel carriers, helicopters, etc. And you have these disruptive new technologies, precision-guided munitions and stealth technology, all in this package produced by this lighthouse. So it's extraordinarily successful. It's well fitted to its challenge set, and it's really well funded, right? But these two conditions were necessary on the front end: a deep understanding and really intimate understanding of the problem, which was the Soviet Union and the Fulda Gap operational challenge, and this control of relevant technologies. And they could control these relevant technologies just through a massive amount of comparative spending. comparative to the Soviets, comparative to other elements, let's say in society or the economy. That the flow of DoD money, like moths to a flame, allowed them to control, shape, and understand technologies that would be relevant for the battlefield, and then apply them to these really well understood problems. So this lighthouse model was actually an incredibly good fit for the Cold War era. So then the Cold War ends. And now we have the 90s and then the GWAT period, which I'm going to call the GWAT coma. So there's some problems arise during this period when it comes to innovation for the military. So for one thing is the problems of the global war on terror were not really operational or technical problems. They were problems about politics, about social, cultural challenges. They were really problems at the level of strategy and policy, as opposed to tactics or operations. The Taliban, Al-Qaeda was never going to tactically or operationally defeat U.S. forces. The failures of the war occurred at these much higher levels. And so when we think of innovations from this period, they largely focus on tactical or really marginal innovations to optimize, like the targeting cycle, the find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze targeting cycle. People are chewing on these deeper problems of how do you get rural Afghans to trust gyroa, et cetera, et cetera. But what's occurring in the background? Well, the deeper systems of war, the capacity for the United States to project power around the world, logistics, sustainment, communications, satellite systems, none of these things were really put at risk during the global war on terror. And so there was really no pressure to innovate or think about vulnerabilities of these deeper structures of warfighting. Because there was no challenge to them at the time. Al-Qaeda was never going to shoot down satellites. Taliban was never going to engage in, large, complex electronic warfare against U.S. forces. So there's a large amount of stagnation in the background, both in terms of lack of state-level pressure to improve those deeper systems of war, and frankly, two other things have gone away by this time. One is that the proportion of R&D spending provided by the Department of Defense from 1960 until the 2000s has declined from 36% to about 3%. So that moths to the flame money to attract the best and brightest scientists, engineers, et cetera, that has gone away. And in fact, now there's multiple corporations in the United States that have larger R&D budgets than the Department of Defense. So we don't have that deep state-level pressure that we had during the Cold War. We don't have that moths to a flame pipeline of money attracting the best and the brightest to these problems. And the third thing, there's a third problem, is the collapse of a vibrant defense sector in the United States, a vibrant market of defense in the United States. So with the end of the Cold War in 1990, we have something called the Last Supper, where defense firms are induced by the Department of Defense to consolidate, to eventually become the primes that we have today, which some would argue are closer to a cartel than a functioning market, that we now have turned into a monopolist kabuki dance between defense primes and the United States government, and that these defense primes developed profitable models since the end of the Cold War to make a lot of money making tiny linear improvements on existing platforms than to actually engage in significant innovation. So this period represents a real, I use the word coma, but a real slowing down of the need and the capacity to innovate at a deeper level. And so what do we see ourselves in now? As opposed to this well-structured problem set that we saw during the Cold War, we have something a little bit more like a mosh pit occurring now. So what is the threat environment for the United States? Well, we talk about 4+1, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, plus VEOs. Some people may start calling it 1+4 now, which is China, and then everything else. It depends who you talk to. So in one sense, there's not this clear prioritization of what is most important for the United States in terms of a threat to focus efforts against. So one is on this demand side for innovation. There's a lot more competing interests globally and functionally all around the world. On the supply side, we have this problem that we just talked about, which is that the DoD does not control or shape primary basic research, applied research, applications, et cetera, that much more of this is occurring outside DoD control, that occurring in the private sector, occurring in other countries. A recent report just came out that was quite disturbing, saying that China is now leading the United States on this whole list of critical technologies, that China is actually outcompeting the United States. And so this, both the structure of the problem set and the capacity to control or at least shape the development of relevant technologies, or even understand the implications of many of these technologies, is now problematic for the Department of Defense. So we have much more of this mosh pit challenge set as opposed to this dangerous but very well-structured challenge set that the United States faced during the Cold War. And so a proposed solution is, one way to think about this is to move from that lighthouse construct to something more like a Christmas tree. And so when we talk about distributed innovation, and Rob, you just talked about all these works, Eagle Works, SoftWorks, all these works, all these innovation boot camps, all of these things that are designed to foster or enable distributed innovation. So we can think of that as, you've got the star at the top of the tree, and that would be your Army Futures Command. That would represent the lighthouse light. But festooned all over the tree are all these little twinkling lights, which you can think of as innovation at the edge of units out in Syria, thinking of ways to do things, folks in Afghanistan modifying, their MRAP to do this, that, or the other. So you can think of this distributed innovation occurring at the edge. And I think this is something that we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years, really growing in energy. So like CMI2's efforts, this is about enabling, fostering, energizing these twinkling lights at the edge of the tree. And I'm sure you all came here to be compared to twinkling lights. But that's occurring at the edge, and that's great. But there's a third critical component of the tree, which I chose. I was on Google Images trying to find the best picture of a Christmas tree, and I chose this picture of a Christmas tree because there's something that's critical to this tree, but you can't see it in this picture. And what is the thing that's critical is the branches, the things that actually connect the twinkling lights back to the vertical structure of the trunk and the star. And I think this is the new challenge space for us, for the DoD, when it comes to innovation. We've got Army Futures Command in the middle. We've got CMI2 efforts, and we've got Eagle Works, and we've got hacking for defense, and all these things occurring at the distributed edge. What we need to work on now are these branches that connect those efforts to the core effort. And this is what I mean. So the problem is, one is, do we have processes in place to identify and harvest tactical or innovations that are occurring at the edge? And the answer is largely, in my opinion, no. That someone comes up with some cool project, they get funding from their unit gets an innovation pot of money, they work with SoftWorks or they work with some other entity to develop a solution to their localized problem, and that's awesome. But do we have a process to identify and harvest best-in-class solutions at the edge, pull them in, and analyze where else they may be relevant across, let's say, the Army, across the service, or even across the Joint Force? One. Two is redundancy of efforts. So right now, a big deal is counter UAS. And you can probably think in your mind, I can think in my mind of at least 20 units, organizations, labs, entities that are chewing on counter UAS issues. And when I encounter one of them and I say, have you talked to these other 6 entities that sounds like are working on the same problem you're working on in a very similar way? The answer is almost invariably no. They're not aware. Now, do we want to centralize everything and consolidate all their efforts? Probably not. But what we at least want to do is have cross-awareness. So at least the STAR knows about all these edge efforts. And there could be opportunities for these edge efforts to be complementary, to be connected to each other, to develop synergies, et cetera. And this is what we're really missing right now. The second thing, and I think the talks later today talking about Ukraine and the state-on-state conflict that we're seeing in Ukraine, and things that we're seeing emerging in Indo-PACOM for sure, are challenges that are not just challenges for a tactical unit that's going to modify its MRAP to deal with IEDs a little bit better. What we're talking about now is these central functions of warfighting for the United States that now need to be dusted off and innovated on. Challenges of projecting power globally, of logistics, communication, sustainment, understanding satellites, how they work, their implication for warfighting. These are things that folks at the edge can serve as sensors, can serve as ideators, et cetera. But these deeper challenges are going to need to be synergized between edge ideation, edge observation, and working with that STAR in the middle to solve these deeper problems. That giving an infantry company an innovation budget and having someone work on a problem, that's not going to solve a satellite systems problem for the DoD. There needs to be synergy between the center and the edge. So this is a big point that I think is this third leg that we're going to need to have the United States military be able to respond to the challenges that it faces. Is not just that STAR, it's not just the twinkling lights, but it's going to be the branches in between to identify, align, and scale innovations for these emerging challenges. And I'm not going to have time to dig into that slide. I want to talk about Ukraine, and obviously the 2 speakers that we have later today are really go into the details of Ukraine. I'm going to talk about, I think, the implications of Ukraine at a much broader level for what they are going to mean for innovation and transformation for the U.S. military. One is the whole panoply of technical things going on in Ukraine, and I think the speakers today are going to really get into a lot of the technical innovations that we're seeing both from the Ukrainians and the Russians, and what that might mean for the types of technology the U.S. military may need to adopt or explore. I think a deeper issue, innovation and transformation-wise, is going to be how the United States conducts warfare. And I think this is going to be more organizational and cultural. And I think this is going to be a huge challenge that's going to require synergy between the edge and the center, which is the problem of mission-oriented command. I think a lot of the things that we're seeing in Ukraine, a lot of the things that we're looking at in the Indo-PACOM AOR are going to be about breaking down communication. And I think there's 2 ways to solve that. One is technical solutions to make sure that you're your comms, your C2 are resilient and cannot be denied or degraded, that would be fantastic. But I do think organizationally and culturally that the United States military needs to get ahead of problems of not just saying mission-oriented command, but actually preparing for, training for, and living mission-oriented command. And I think, once again, this will be something that it cannot be solved at the edge, would have to be solved in conjunction with that star in the middle. I know we're running behind schedule already. I'm not going to go too much further. I'm going to now make a super shameless plug. As Rob said, I'm out at the Naval Postgraduate School. We've got a lot of Army students come through, get their master's degree at MPS. I'm in the Defense Analysis Department. We'd love to see more Army folks come through. Right now we have a lot of RSOF folks, but we would love to get folks from other elements of the Army as well. 101st Airborne, it'd be fantastic to see more folks from your organization out there. I work in, as Rob said, a curriculum called Applied Design for Innovation, and we have students come through there that's not SOF specific, come through there and use their graduate time to both learn, but also tackle an innovation challenge that would be of utility for their organization or their community. When I was, recently been doing work on this topic and working with two former students who came through our program, Major Scott Rowan, 3rd group guy, Phil Swintek, 10th group guy. Scott Rowan did his work on the implications of blockchain and digital currency for over-the-horizon enablement of partners. Fantastic project. Really looked at bringing in different communities, the fintech, private sector community, interagency. He hosted a conference on this topic recently. He's become a bit of an expert on it. Phil Swintek actually got a dual degree in our department in space systems operation. He designed and prototyped and tested a CubeSat solution for denied comms challenges for globally distributed SOF operations. So folks can come out and, work on these challenges out there as they're earning their graduate degree. So if anybody's interested in chatting more about that, my contact information is here. But once again, the big takeaway from what I've been talking about today is the fact that our legacy lighthouse system of innovation and transformation is not structurally suited to the challenge set that we're facing moving forward. It needs 2 additional pieces, these twinkling lights and these branches. I think people are waking up to this twinkling light problem, and we're seeing a lot of energy around enabling distributed innovation at the edge, and I think that's fantastic. But I think the next challenge for the DoD will be building those branches, of having the central apparatus be able to identify, harvest, and scale up the best innovations from the edge. And with that, I will stop talking and see if anybody has any questions or comments. And if not, I'll hand it back to Rob.
Any questions from the crowd?
Hi, Captain Lawson, sir. Thank you for coming. Was just wondering, based on your idea of the Christmas tree with the lights, I know we're talking about the branches, and I don't know the solution to that problem, but do you feel like the Army has the right lights at this point? Are there areas where, Eagle Works is one cell work different than all the other places? Where do you see improvement in that area?
Yeah, I mean, I'm admittedly, I'm much more specific with the SOF community, the SOF components. And I'd actually be curious what your thoughts are, or other people's thoughts about where the Army is in terms of, are they putting energy and resources and incentive structures? I think that's really important as well. A big problem for edge, trying to foster edge innovation is having an organization that's usually focused on sort of no-fail standards, whereas a lot of experimentation innovation involves a lot of trial and error. And so like I said, I'm less familiar with the big Army and where they put their efforts, but I think, you know, I'd be curious what your thoughts are in terms of, are they putting resourcing, opportunity, and providing incentive structures for people to prototype or think or experiment or share new ideas at the edge in the Army? That was a total non-answer on my part. So yeah.
Yeah, I would say we don't have the incentive structure right now. Is there something that the soft community is doing to incentivize prototyping and innovation?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say marginally better, but not great, right? Baking into the cake that like every project you work on or every idea that you have is not going to be a grand slam, and baking into the cake that part of the learning process is about stubbing your toe. It's about error. You can't, when people talk about we're going to engage in innovation stuff, and then their immediate next question is what's the return on investment? I mean, that type of thinking that everything's going to be a win is a problem, especially because all we see promoted and on the websites are wins. And we've got to understand that this experimentation and prototyping process will involve a lot of non-wins. And I think that's absolutely critical. So.
We have any other questions from the crowd? All right, let's take a quick 10-minute break and we'll get back to it. All right, welcome back everyone from the break. We have about 30 minutes before our next guest speaker comes on. So I wanted to jump on briefly and talk about another concept that kind of goes along with our theme today. And this is one of content versus context. This kind of way of framing or visualizing a lot of the kind of tension that we've talked about in here, that tension of seeing the changes in the environment, seeing the drones in Ukraine, seeing the new forms of fighting and war, and the tactics being displayed on Twitter every day, and having that dissonance with your own current training plans, your training pipelines, your mission essential, excuse me, your mission essential task list that you have to meet every day. So the content of a unit in the military aspect is the standard mode of operating, the day in and day in tasks, the repetition, the doctrine, the SOPs that we have to follow as we work our way from progression. It's the year in and year out training plans that we all put in. It's the doctrine. It's those metal tasks that we have to get green on in order to move on and assure our commanders that we're prepared for the next fight. And it's shaped by the institutional memory of the conflicts and the doctrine that's been imposed upon us from the last 20 years of conflict. The context, on the other hand, is the operational environment in which we would have to operate. It's the battlefields of Ukraine. It's the always present conflicts in the Middle East. It's the potential for Taiwan. It's the potential for China. The context can vary and change, and it can change quickly. New and emerging technologies, black swan events as seen in Gaza, unanticipated future scenarios can all affect the context within which we operate. So if you look at this graphic and you visualize this horizontal line, this is your content. You have a left to right progression, and we work to build our units of action through annual training requirements, and we try to progress up along that line year in, year out. Personnel leave, personnel come. We have to rebuild, we have to retrain. On one side, you see doing it poorly as your beginning mark that we all have come to love when you have the summer turnovers of officers, summer turnovers of personnel, the SWIC levies, etc. And on the other side, you have you're doing it well. So as we move through these lines, you have your individual tasks, your individual schools, you move to your crew and team training, you move up to squad, you start doing live fires, you start feeling proficient, you get your platoons and companies T for trained, you get your culminating validation exercises. You get your trips to JRTC, et cetera, to where you pat yourself on the back on the right end saying, we are trained and we are doing it well. Now, the context is something that I think we neglect a lot of the time, and that's what we've discussed a few earlier today. And that line makes this look more like a quadrant. So if we start looking at this as instead of a linear progression and looking at it more of quadrants, we can add doing the right thing at the top and doing the wrong thing down at the bottom. So now instead of moving ourselves from left to right, we have to look at these quadrants as where we're at on the scheme of how all this works out in the military. So I know everyone in here is going to put themselves up there. You're doing the right thing and you're doing it well. You've been training all year. You've been doing all the hard tasks. You're green on all the trackers. You've gotten all your shots, thank God. And you're up there and you're doing the right thing. The question that you should ask yourself isn't, are we on the left and right progression line all the way to the end, but where's the most dangerous part or quadrant that you can find yourself as a military? And it's not doing it poorly. It's not doing the right thing or the wrong thing on the poor side, but it's the assurance that we're doing the right thing, and then we find ourselves no longer contextually relevant to the fight, and we charge ahead thinking we're doing the right event. A couple of examples just for to visualize this, because that's how I like to learn. The outbreak of World War I, it was kind of a nexus of old and new warfare styles kind of merged together. Case in point, the French cavalry showing up to the first battles on the Eastern Front. They were known as some of the most proficient and fierce cavalry units in Europe leading up to that fight. Showed up in their bright red pantaloon pants and their armored plating chest plates and their plumed helmets, and they were probably a sight to see. Napoleon probably loved them on his day. But they were probably considered themselves fairly proficient in what they did. They probably trained and drilled, and they had repetition, and they moved themselves up and said, we are the best cavalry units, we do it well, and we're doing the right thing. Unfortunately, new technologies and new ways of conflict, the barbed wire, the machine guns, the trenches, left their old, outdated tactics no longer to be relevant. Second Nagorno-Karabakh War, region battle between Azerbaijan and Armenia. This region is a hotspot for the conflict and protracted war between the two nations as they battle over the disputed region in the middle. In the late 80s, early 90s, the two countries fought in a protracted mountainous defensive conflict that spanned over 3 years of intense fighting and 6 years of conflict. With over 30,000 estimated dead, the Armenians pulled off a delayed victory of attrition and defensive maneuvering that ensured their control over the disputed region. Fast forward to 2020, the conflict flares up anew, and we see Armenia doing similar tactics and similar technologies that they were using in previous conflicts. They relied on defensive networks in the mountains and hidden anti-aircraft and hidden artillery positions in order to count themselves in the victory that they had seen in the previous conflict. The Azerbaijanis, on the other hand, with the help of foreign partners, showcased a blitzkrieg, if you will, of new technologies. They had loitering munitions. They conducted electronic warfare. They tricked the Armenians into giving away their positions. They conducted raids behind enemy lines. In essence, they changed their scope of warfare, and Armenia failed to grasp the contextual understanding of what that should look like. Azerbaijan was able to pull off in 44 days of conflict what they failed to do in the previous 3 years. So last thing I want to push on here before we get ready for the next speaker The contextual line, that up and down, doing the right thing, doing the wrong thing, is what we're here to talk about. It's something that, in my mind, is neglected regularly. But when we train on the content, the left and right, through our standard tasks, but fail to train on the context or the changes in the environment, the new technologies, we set ourselves up for those potential failures that we've seen in throughout the history books. So working on that context can be done through training ongoing conflicts, as we're going to hear next from our next speaker. It's through working through forecasting and prediction. As we know how our acquisition pipeline takes years, we can't prepare for what's happening right now because by the time we get it, it'll be too late. And then testing and evaluation. As I mentioned earlier, our Dirt Days events that we host are tailor-made and set up for units to come out and test and try and see what works, see what doesn't, see what fails. Tactical integration, as I mentioned in the pillars discussion, taking those tactics, evolving them, incorporating new technologies, seeing what you can change, and again, testing those new ideas out in real time. And then finally, that operational divergence that we discussed, where new tactics merge together to create new operating concepts. So I wanted to throw this in there real quick, so we had a little bit of time trying to catch up from this late start this morning. We have Major General Mick Ryan will be on next. He's going to be talking about Ukraine and his observations. It's going to take him a few minutes to get dialed in, so please just give us a few seconds while we get this hooked up. He should be on in about 10 minutes, so please take another break. Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back from the break. Our next speaker, Major General retired Mick Ryan, spent 35 years in the Australian Army and had the honor of commanding soldiers at troop, squadron, regiment, task force, and brigade levels. He has a long-standing interest in military history and strategy, advanced technologies, organizational innovation, and adaptation theory. He was inaugural president of the Defense Entrepreneurs Forum, Australia, and is a member of the Military Writers Guild. He's a keen author on the interface of military strategy, innovation, and advanced technologies, as well as how institutions can develop their intellectual edge. In February of 2022, Mick retired from the Australian Army. In the same month, his book, War Transformed, was published by USNI Books. He's an adjunct fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., and a non-resident fellow of the Lowy Institute in Sydney. January 2023, Mick was also appointed as an adjunct professor at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. He runs his own strategic advisory company, has written regular columns for the Sydney Morning Herald and ABC Australia. He has frequent commentary appearances on ABC TV, the BBC, and CNN. His latest book, White Sun War, The Campaign for Taiwan, was published on 4 May 2023 by Casemate Books. His next book, about strategy and adaptation in Ukraine war, will be published in mid-2024. Mick, can you hear me, sir?
I sure can. It's great to be with you.
Hey, thank you for joining us. I will hand it off to you for your presentation and your time.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for the invitation to speak, Rob. It's great to be with you all today. And I hope this entire session, not just mine, but all of them, are useful for you to prompt you to think about, where we might be going next in the profession of arms and assist in building more effective organisations at the different levels at which we operate. Today, I want to talk about three things. Firstly, I actually want to talk about failure, because I think in military institutions, we need to focus on failure, firstly, to make sure it doesn't happen to us, but secondly, to learn from the failure of others. So I want to talk about that a little bit, because failure is often what drives significant organisational adaptation and reform. So I think we need to understand it, particularly in the modern sense. Secondly, I want to talk about some battlefield trends that I've observed in my frequent visits to Ukraine, as well as I've been down to Gaza and southern Israel, as well as Taiwan. And then I'll just talk about, well, what are some of the things that organisations can do to give themselves the best chance of winning in modern war? And at the end of the day, that is what it's about. It's about winning. And I think too often, too many organisations don't use that W word, but I think we really need to use it and focus on achieving it. So next slide, please. So that's the scope I just discussed. Next slide, please. So getting things wrong has to be a focus for us to ensure that we don't. I put a quote up here by the late great Wick Murray, who talks about how the profession of arms is the most morally, intellectually, and physically demanding profession. And he's right on the money there. It is. You know that. I know that. And it's something that we don't just have to hone our bodies for, but it's something we absolutely must hone our minds for. Next. And we've seen in the last couple of years the price of failure. We've seen what happens when we get this wrong, when we haven't planned things right, when we haven't prepared right, when we haven't organised right, and when we haven't led right. The first example, obviously, is the Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023. I think this is a very salutary lesson for all of us of what happens when, firstly, we fail to respect the capacity of our adversaries, but also fail to understand that perhaps existing doctrine, existing organisation, existing training may not be up to the task. And the failure of that 2023 counteroffensive had really significant human, but as well as strategic and political impacts for the Ukrainians, which in some way are still resonating. Next slide. And obviously, the failure on 7 October last year sent a shockwave, not just through the people of Israel, but the Middle East more broadly. There are many, many reasons for the failure, and there are cultural reasons. There are, once again, failure of humility. There were failures of readiness. There are many failures of leadership at very different levels, from tactical all the way to the most strategic and political levels. But what it resulted in, once again, beyond the terrible human cost, has been a strategic disaster for Israel, a really difficult political era for other governments around the world. It certainly impacted on focus for Ukraine. It certainly had a major impact for other peoples, Gazans and others around the region. So, failure has very, very profound impacts, and it goes without saying we should be avoiding it where we can. Next slide. But, innovation and change is really tough. There are many institutional obstructions, there are leadership obstructions, there are financial obstructions, there are traditions that get in the way. But many organisations in the past have gone through that process, often as a result of failure. I often use the one of the Australian Army in the First World War. We came out of Gallipoli, even though we lost that one. We thought we knew modern war, went straight to the Western Front, and in our very first night there lost 5,500 men. But in the wake of that, totally reformed the training, the organisation and the leadership to form the First Corps, which was very successful by 1918. Next slide. But as tough as innovation and change is hard, losing is much harder. And our job is to ensure that that does not happen to our soldiers. Next slide. So I'd like to now talk about some of the trends that I've observed over the last couple of years in battlefields, primarily in Ukraine, but also in the Middle East. I've been to Ukraine 4 times now. I've only just come back from my most recent trip. Had the opportunity to talk to lots of military, government, non-government crowdfunders, NGOs, journalists, and citizens. And there is a lot of really interesting material coming out at the tactical level, but also the operational and strategic level for us. Next slide. And I think one of the most interesting over the last couple of years has been this development of meshed civil military sensor and analytical networks, which have really deepened what I call the signature battle. The battle to relax your signatures down into the noise so you don't become a HVT, and to pick out the most high-value signatures so we can target the enemy. So this signature battle has manifestations across individuals, across equipment, across organisations, as well as planning and intentions. And I think we really need to focus on this. Certainly, I knew as a brigade commander, we did this a lot. We had Navy P3s or Air Force P3s flying over all the time, measuring electromagnetic signatures, heat signatures, visual signatures, noise signatures, smell signatures, every kind of signature you could imagine, to try and unpick that for the different types of units in the brigade. Well, what we're seeing now is, it's much, much harder than it was even just a short time ago. And what this signature battle has manifested in is a detection to destruction gap that is very, very small indeed, probably down to a minute for many high value targets. And that's going to really force a shift in how we think about tactics, how we think about organising, how we think about force posture more broadly. Next slide, please. I think a really important trend we've seen in this war is what I'd call democratised digital command and control. Now, digital command and control has been a trend for quite some time. Any of you who were involved in the march up to Baghdad in 2003 will have seen, Blue Force Tracker and these kind of tools used to track locations and provide rudimentary reporting. This is an art and a science that has moved on significantly since then. But even then, before the war, most organisations were looking at this, particularly in armies, down to about the platoon, maybe squad level. What the Ukrainians have done is taken it to the next level by putting this down to individual level. Two key systems here. There's quite a few different digital systems they use, but the two key ones, firstly, is Delta, which was developed before the war, done in coordination with NATO, although there's not full connectivity. That goes down to about brigade level. And then Cropia, which is the one that goes down below brigade level, which individuals can use to upload enemy locations, pull down data, but also call for fire. These are really, I think, transformed battle space awareness and the ability to implement mission command. By no means would the Ukrainian army claim to be perfect, but its junior leaders have a fair amount of tactical acumen and initiative, which these systems enable. And I think we really need to learn, well, what are the pros and cons of this? And, I've spent time with the Office of Digital Transformation in Kiev to talk about some of the systemic data management, security and assurance issues that come with this democratizing of digital command and control in such a large and dispersed organization. Next slide, please. This is probably the least surprising trend I'll talk to you about today. And indeed, uncrewed systems are nothing new. We saw them emerge in the Second World War with the German remote-controlled mine tanks and the US Air Force's remote-controlled B-17 explosive-laden bombers. And we've seen them develop at varying speeds over the last several decades. The war in Iraq, certainly, particularly in the counter-ID battle, pushed forward the development of uncrewed or remote control systems. But what we've seen in the last 2 years is really unprecedented. It is indeed a Cambrian explosion, the most intense period of innovation in autonomous, semi-autonomous and remotely controlled systems that we have seen in the history of these things. And whilst it's primarily in aerial systems in the first couple of years of the war, and the Ukrainians in many respects have led this through their development of many indigenous systems, because foreign autonomous systems just did not have the electromagnetic hardening required. The Russians have been fast followers. Now, when I spoke with the Ukrainian Minister for Strategic Industries last month, they're planning on being able to make about 1 million a year of these things, and thousands of the longer range autonomous drones that they use to target Russian systems. Their key problems at the moment, firstly, larger warheads on longer range drones. Secondly, last mile targeting, which is targeting free from the operator. They have achieved that. I've seen it. And the third one is achieving battlefield swarming. They have not yet achieved that. And they'll be the first to admit this is a very difficult thing to achieve. But we've also seen autonomy expand into the maritime environment. The Ukrainian Navy has developed multiple generations of uncrewed, semi-submersible maritime attack drones that I would hope countries like my own might invest in buying. But also in the ground environment, you're starting to see a larger array of uncrewed ground combat vehicles, many of which are armed. And we're even starting to see, as late as last week, Ukrainian aerial FPV drones attacking Russian uncrewed ground combat drones. So you are actually starting to see robotic combat on the ground in Ukraine. And this is a trend that is only going to continue rolling out across all the domains. And indeed, next year, the Ukrainians are planning on building around 2 million drones. This is just an unbelievable figure, even for the US military, even just a couple of years ago, but it is now being normalised as what we're all probably going to have to engage in. Next slide. And I think this is a really interesting trend over the last few years with the mix of commercial sensor technology and longer range drones. The barriers to entry for deep strike have been significantly lowered. We've seen the Houthis being able to do this, clearly Hezbollah and Hamas have been able to do this, as have others. But we're also seeing a more persistent capacity for surveillance, much, much deeper than we saw even just 6 months ago. And indeed, the Russians have been now able to maintain persistent surveillance around 100 kilometres behind the front line in a way they haven't previously. The picture on the screen there is attack on a Ukrainian helicopter forward operating base that they thought was well out of range of Russian surveillance and fires. It wasn't. And things like HIMARS now are much more threat than they were even 6 months ago. So this cheaper and better deep strike complex is something that we're going to have to defend against, not just against near peer adversaries, but almost every adversary in the future. Next slide. When I published my book back in 2022, it came out about 10 days before the war in Ukraine. I wrote about mass and the return of mass as a feature of modern military operations. A lot of people thought I might have been smoking something. That people thought that, well, no, we're in a precision era. We don't do mass operations anymore. Well, Mr. Putin had a different idea, and the war in Ukraine and even the war in Gaza has changed that. But the mass we're seeing is different to what our grandfathers would have seen in the Second World War, or even what we might have seen in the 1991 Gulf War with the big left hook. Mass now clearly involves firepower and armour and the mobilisation of people, but it clearly also includes masses of autonomous systems across the domains and the mass application of information operations across the tactical through to the political realms. And we need to be able to understand mass as a physical and non-physical thing now, and we need to ensure that we're able to operate as a mass organisation and destroy those who might use mass against us. Now, the Russians, who look at this very closely, have understood that we prefer to use precision than mass, and they're now engaging in counter-precision warfare in Ukraine to degrade GPS, to degrade the use of precision munitions, like whether it's HIMARS or other weapon systems, and that has had an impact on the battlefield in the last couple of years as well. So we really need to think about what that means for how we structure ourselves, how we employ forces, and if we want to sustain operations for any length of time, how we might engage in a larger mobilisation of national capacity, including people, for large-scale operations over a long period of time, which is what we'll probably be engaged in if we do get engaged in a war with China. Next slide. I think integration is a continuing trend. I mean, we clearly saw the development of joint operations in the Second World War. the global war on terror saw us having to integrate military and civil operations with Department of State and other entities. I think we're at the next level now with the degree of interaction between joint services and coalition partners. But also, we've seen different kinds of integration in this war, some of which have worked, some of which haven't. I mean, combined arms clearly in the initial stages of the work did not work for both sides. They just hadn't trained to the degree they needed to in combined arms. Air-land operations weren't optimised at the start of the war. The integration of electronic warfare with combat and support operations wasn't optimised. Well, they both learned, they both improved to that end. But we've also seen the integration of Soviet era and Western equipment in the air defence system that the Ukrainians have developed, and that's been integrated with civil technologies, Palantir and other firms that have used big data to aggregate information, as well as civil technologies like mobile phones, which are strung up on many telephone poles around Ukraine to detect Shahed drones coming in using their receivers and then to report back into a central system. So, I really think that working together, integrating lots of different things is the future of military organisations, probably to a degree we haven't seen previously. Next slide, please. And the final trend is the adaptation battle. This is going on constantly, particularly if you're a smart organisation, you have a systemic approach to it. If you're not a smart organisation, you have a disconnected and uneven approach to it. And that's what we've seen largely in the first year of this war, although the Ukrainians are better at tactical adaptation. But I think both countries have developed systems now that allow tactical adaptations to be shared better laterally, but also up the chain to become more strategic through interventions in training, doctrine, equipment procurement, research and development, and things like this. This is something that doesn't just happen. Firstly, it has to be led. At the tactical level, it's as simple as after-action reviews and things like this, but it's something that absolutely is the responsibility of leaders. But secondly, it's something that must be nurtured and honed before war. You need a foundational platform for learning and adaptation before you get engaged in warfare. And both sides in the Ukraine war clearly had a foundation of this before the war. The Ukrainians in particular in Donbass were doing lots of interesting things that we just weren't paying attention to, and that allowed them to develop an adaptive stance that served them well in this war. The Israelis have created a adaptation command where all the lessons from Gaza, from the north, from the West Bank, all flow in, are analysed and shared very rapidly. So it takes good leadership. It takes the nurturing of a learning culture by good leaders, the creation of time to think about and share lessons, but it also requires a systemic approach to more rapidly change organisations and change procurement systems to be responsive to what's going on the battlefield rather than responsive to those who may not want to take political risk with large-scale procurement systems. Next slide, please. So given these trends and given the imperative to change and avoid failure, what does that mean for generating advantage in modern conditions? I think there are four key areas that we could focus on and perhaps discuss in the Q&A session. Next slide. The first one is new ideas are vital. This isn't just a technological struggle that we're involved in. We're in a struggle of ideas, whether it's large-scale political ideas about the value of democracy all the way through to new operational warfighting concepts, new strategies, and new tactical doctrines. Next slide. Now, the competition of ideas has been going on for a very long time. But I think, the Chinese and Russians have put a lot of thought into ideas about modern war. And until recently, we might suggest the Russian ideas haven't been tested. But, I think some of their ideas have been tested and found wanting, but some of their ideas are clearly working. as abhorrent as meat tactics and things like this might be to us, from a Russian perspective, they're working. And clearly in this war, the Russians have developed a level of momentum that we have to be very uncomfortable with, and we should be doing something to reverse. The Chinese also have developed ideas like systems destruction warfare and multi-domain precision warfare that they're working towards. Now, this doesn't mean they're good at it. It doesn't mean that we're not going to make it very, very difficult for them to implement them. But we really need to pay attention to them, and we should be not just combating these ideas, but building better ones ourselves. Next slide. Now, I think there's 5 key operating problems that we have at the moment that we don't possess optimal solutions for. I wrote about this in Modern War Institute article recently, and I think all of them have been in evidence over the last 12 months in the war in Ukraine, particularly during the Ukrainian counteroffensive, but also in the Russian offensives right now, even with a significant advantage in manpower and an overwhelming 10-to-1 advantage in firepower for the last few months. The Russians have only been able to make small gains in territory in the east and northeast. This just talks to the power of the defensive with some of the new technologies I talked about in the trends, and the lack of new ideas in being able to achieve tactical and operational breakthroughs. We really need to turn our heads to this, because part of a deterrence regime is an effective offensive regime, and certainly part of winning wars is the ability to go on the offensive and destroy our enemies. Next slide. And one of the things I'm really attracted to when it comes to thinking about new ideas is this notion of responsible rebellion. Some of you may have worked with General Dempsey or read his book that I've got on the screen there, No Time for Spectators. I think it's one of the best books on military leadership that's out there from a contemporary leader. I had the honour of working for General Dempsey in Iraq in 2005. He is the real deal, but he writes about this concept of responsible rebellion in his book. And he says, it's not about throwing everything out. You never get a blank sheet of paper in a military institution, but you can challenge the status quo in a way that enhances your ability to win, but also just doesn't, destroy the entire operating system while you're doing so. So, it's a book I'd really commend to you, and an idea and a way of thinking about innovation and adaptation that I find useful. Next slide. And as the great Andy Marshall, who ran your Office on Net Assessment for decades, said, this isn't a battle for the best technologies only. It's about a battle to combine the best technologies with the best new organisations and the best ideas to come up with strategic and operational advantage. Next slide, please. So it's not just about new ideas, as Marshall said, it's also about rethinking new organisations. Next slide. And this is something we've done in the past, right? When new technologies emerge, we rethought operations and how we organise for battle and for war. Air forces clearly were one of the outcomes of this, armoured divisions, but it wasn't just warfighting organisations. It was educational and training institutions which were developed in the interwar period. Governments and senior military officials found that they just weren't intellectually prepared to the degree they should have been for large-scale industrial warfare that featured in World War I. So we saw the birth in the 1920s of war colleges. First one was the Imperial War College in London, and then these higher-level educational institutions then proliferated through places in the US, in Europe, in Russia, and Japan. More recently, we've seen new organisations such as the Space Force, the Marine Littoral Regiment. We've seen the Chinese go through having a strategic space force, and then more recently split this up into information support force, cyber and space forces. The US Navy with its unmanned surface vessel divisions, and the Ukrainian drone service, not just drone squadrons, but a drone service. So there are really interesting examples out there that we might look at of new organisations that are attempting to deal with new technologies and new eras and problems in warfighting. Next slide. I think it's fair to say that most institutions in peacetime are of varying degrees risk adverse. That comes from political imperatives, but it also is just what happens to military institutions in peacetime. The managerial takes over from the warfighting excellence. And we need to, as much as we can, fight that imperative. And part of the way we do that, I've already spoken about nurturing innovation and leading adaptation, but it's also about accepting more risk and defining what acceptable failure is. Because failure is an integral part of learning and training in any good military institution. So good leaders, as part of nurturing a learning environment, need to be very explicit about, well, this is the kind of areas where I think you're going to fail, and that's acceptable because I think you're going to learn from it. And to the same degree, I think good leaders talk about where they have failed. I think we see too many books written by senior leaders who only talk about their successes, whereas the reality is every successful leader has had multiple failures in their career. I know I did. And you need to talk about these things because people need to understand one failure isn't the end of everything. It's just part of a learning journey. So I think that's an important part of nurturing a more enlightened approach to failure, learning, and adaptation. I put some other books up there that you might consider reading on adaptation and learning. Maya Finkel's terrific books are worth reading. Frank Hoffman's recent Mars Adapting is fabulous. Wheat and Sutcliffe's book on high reliability organisation, Barno and Ben Shale's books are also terrific. Next slide. And the final area, if you're going to develop an advantage at every level, is the command leadership and human development aspects. I mean, I see a lot on new technologies, and that's very useful. But for me, it's all about humans. At the end of the day, war is a human activity. Machines don't make the decisions to go to war. Machines don't develop strategies. Machines don't inspire humans to go that extra mile or to make the ultimate sacrifice. It's humans and good leaders that do. Next slide, please. And I've written quite extensively about what I call an intellectual edge, particularly a composite one that comprises individual and institutional intellectual edges, particularly with individuals, where we train and educate people to be able to outthink the adversary. You can't outfight an adversary if you can't outthink them. And we need to do that as individuals, but we need to be able to do it as teams. Next. And I think there are 4 other elements of this intellectual edge. Be humble and curious intellectually. None of us know everything. And my journey has been the more I've learned, the more I've found out I don't know. I think it's an important part of intellectual development for soldiers and leaders. The second one is be competitive. There's nothing wrong with being ferociously competitive. I know in my system, sometimes that is a bad C word, and I'm not sure where that's come from, but we need to be very cautious in dispensing with competition across a whole range of endeavours. I see things in kids' schools where we have non-competitive sports now, and I just don't understand that. I can't understand how sport can be non-competitive, and I don't understand why we're not setting our kids up to be competitive, given that everything is a competition once they leave school, whether it's finding an apartment or getting a job. I think a really important part of developing the intellectual capacity to outthink an adversary is expecting to be surprised. This is just what happens in democracies, and it's just what happens in war. Now, we'll do everything we can as leaders to try and prevent that, but the reality is that we must be preparing our people with the individual and team resilience to fight through the shock that is the result of surprise, whether it's tactical or strategic. So plan on being surprised, integrated into your training. And finally, the most important thing I think that leaders can do is provide purpose. That is what inspires people. It is what underpins mission command. And it's something that no robot, no AI can ever do for our soldiers. Next slide. So I hope that's provided some useful insights. It's been great talking to you today. I'd like to finish, next slide, with a quote from a British academic who served as a officer in the Second World War, the late Sir Michael Howard. He gave a speech in 1973 about the mindset of military organisations, particularly their leaders. And he talked about how the military, who all too frequently see themselves as an old order defending civilised values against a revolutionary threat. But he said what they really need to be and what they should see themselves as is intelligent surf riders, spotting the essential currents in a sea which is disturbed, but which is by no means friendly. But if they are skillful enough, they'll survive. And next slide. My view is your mission in this era is be the intelligent surf riders. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions anyone in the audience might have. Thank you.
We'll open it up to questions in the audience. Anyone got anything they want to ask today?
Hey, sir. Thank you for being here. I'm Major Hoffman, the Chief Innovation Officer, which at a basic level is basically our STEM laboratory at the 101st. I heard the other day.
It sounds like an awesome job. I wish I had it.
It is, sir. It's a very awesome job. We take the problems from soldiers who are face to face with it, and they come to us with ideas, and we try to prototype out either an actual physical product or system or improve a process that they've been having an issue with, because that's what they deal with on a day-to-day. So bottom-up refinement, so to speak. But my question is, I heard some inklings from some of the forums that the official like Army forums that I'm in here at work, that we might be trying to start our own UAS or drone branch as a separate MOS. Have you seen any of that in the other militaries?
I mean, that wouldn't surprise me. I think there's been a trend towards that over years. I mean, the ownership and use of uncrewed systems in the US Army has gone from several branches, right? I mean, aviation's owned it, intelligence owned it, and I think now there's enough information out there to perhaps have a drone branch as a centre of expertise. I don't think it needs to own everything. I still think squads, platoons, troops, companies, squadrons, battalions, brigades will need their own operating capacity at different tiers. But if there's a drone MOS one, it might streamline and standardise the training of operators and maintainers, which I think is important, because remember, for every drone, it's not just an operator. You've got armourers, you've got those getting the surveillance feed, those who are sharing it, and all those kind of things. So it might be useful in that regard, just as we have schools for infantry soldiers or artillery, combat engineers, and other MOS. But I don't think it would take away the imperative for our soldiers to have their own uncrewed systems, whether they're aerial or ground or even maritime or even subterranean.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
We have any other questions out there? Got one more coming, sir.
Good morning, our time, sir. I'm Charlie Goff, I'm Civil Affairs Officer in the division here. And my question is focused more on how we can prevent and kind of where we see a lot of our soft forces aligned right now in the places before Bang. So I'm a European-based guy, so I spend a lot of time in the Balkans, where there's a lot of simmering conflicts in Republika Srpska in Bosnia, as well as Kosovo and Serbia, and then Moldova as well. What kind of things can we be doing now so that we are preparing those spaces in the case of conflict in the future, and also preventing conflict for the rest of the world? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think there's nothing new here in how we prepare before war. It's just be really brilliant at the basics, and the basics are things like have a really tough, systematized training program with clear operating outcomes from it. You'd be surprised how many organisations don't get that right. Have a good leadership development and selection regime at every level. Have a good program to study the ground where you might fight. When I talk about the grain, I don't just mean the physical terrain, I mean the human terrain. And then understand the enemy, understand what they're capable of, understand how they develop their people, what their command and control mechanisms are like, what their command philosophies are. If you can do all those kind of things, I think that one, that's 365 days a year, right? I mean, soldiering, if you're a professional, is a very busy profession and it's a tough one. But if you can do all those things, you are optimally prepared for the first fight to learn from it and adapt and stay ahead of the enemy in the adaptation battle when the big fight comes. And it's coming.
It absolutely is, sir. And one of the trends that I was prone to seeing when I was forward was we often struggle with that, with sharing information in the information space in those countries where we have many U.S. partners and sister service partners or joint partners in those regions. We don't do a good job right now of sharing our information, flattening communication before we get into these conflicts. So something that we're thinking about here. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a tough one. I mean, it's a tough one even with your closest friends and allies. We have Australians as Deputy Commanding General, USARPAC, and Deputy J2 at Indo-PACOM. I'm actually in Hawaii, so I've been talking with all these folks, and information sharing is still an issue. No fawn is a pretty serious undertaking in the US military. Um, and sometimes you do have to have things that is just yours when it comes to information, but there are other times where information does need to flow more freely. I think one of the things, or one area where you might be able to reform a bit is give commanders a little more flexibility in what sensitive information they share. I think the FDO cohort sometimes exercises too much control and the commanders hand that over. I think commanders need a little bit more authority to share sensitive information. I know that's how it works in my system, where commanders have a lot more control about what sensitive information they're able to hand to people with lower security clearances, whether it's our own countrymen or people from other countries.
Sir, I have a question from our online forum. Mr. John Dewey asks, how has new technology and the consequential impacts to tactics changed communication methodologies and vulnerabilities? Additionally, have older technologies such as the use of HF frequencies had a resurgence as a result?
Yeah, I mean, this has been pretty interesting. In Ukraine, VHF, HF was a method they avoided after the early days of the war because it's too easy to triangulate, find, and target to intercept. So that's why you saw this massive shift to satellite communications as a principal bearer, both for voice and data. It's not the exclusive one. There is, obviously some tactical comms that's not Starlink based, but largely it's Starlink based because it's a more secure bearer. It certainly has the capacity for digital command and control and the massive data requirements, and the assurance and security elements are easier. Now, we're probably not going to get away with that only in the next fight, so we do need to think about more secure forms of our standard communications. But also, what do you use them for? So, when I was a brigade commander, I had a combat brigade, 7 battalions. I almost never used my brigade command net because I'd just come out of Iraq and Afghanistan. I knew what we'd been doing against the enemy on his command net, and it didn't make sense to me to be constantly on the command net talking when I had a more secure, secret sat com that I could send text messages or I could be at the right place at the right time, and I was constantly circulating. So I just think it's a mixture of technology, but also processes and how we teach our commanders to use different communications means to lower their signature, lower the signature of their headquarters, and ensure they have a more survivable command and control framework. The only thing I would say, though, is at the same time, we need to train to fight disconnected. I think we've known this for a while, but the Russians focus on taking away Ukrainian comm, as the Chinese will to us whenever that happens. So things like mission command, training junior leaders, being able to fight and win disconnected has to be an important part of our command philosophy and our training regime.
Thank you for that, sir. Do we have any other questions out here? All right, sir. I think that wraps it up on our end. We really appreciate you dialing in. I know it's very early for you over there and on your way back on your travels. So safe travels, and thank you for dialing in. Thank you for all that you do, and thank you for your work providing these insights out to kind of help the tactical level soldiers get their head wrapped around these emergent problems that they should be looking at.
Hey, no problem. It's a privilege to be with you, and hopefully something of what I've said is useful. So I wish you all every success in the future and good soldiering.
Thank you again, ladies and gentlemen. General Mick Ryan. Everyone, welcome back from lunch. We're going to get this started and get moving along. Next speaker we have up for you is Mr. August Cole. He's an author exploring the future of conflict through fiction and other forms of ficant or fictional intelligence storytelling. With Peter W. Singer, he's the co-author of the best-selling Ghost Fleet, a novel of the next world war, and Burn In, a novel of the real robotic revolution. With Singer, he's a co-founder and managing partner at Useful Fiction, which works with the U.S. and allied militaries and government agencies at the center of narrative, foresight, and change management focused on defense and security. August also is a non-resident senior fellow at the Scowcraft Center on Strategy and Security and an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. August Cole.
Well, all right, everybody's settled into their chairs after lunch. I'm going to have you move closer to the stage a little bit because we have an intimate gathering opportunity here today. So let's use it. And besides, talking after lunch is always tricky too, right? Because everyone's getting super comfortable and sleepy. Although the air temperature here hopefully will make it too hard for anybody to start dozing off. So, in the arc of this day, we started out with Leo looking back, talking about the Cold War and recent history. Mick talked about the moment we're in and looked ahead. And what I'm going to talk about then is if we had past, we have present, I'm going to talk about the future, but through the lens of today and the stories and the kinds of narratives that I've used to try to make sense of the future of conflict. My hope is that when you're done, with this hour or so session that I'll be leading, you'll have a sense of the value of some new forms of, foresight. A lot of people would think it's heretical to use something like fiction to, make actual decisions that impact things like national security. But I would say that, narrative being one of the oldest and best technologies around, like we're storytelling animals, it's one of the most effective. But it's also not the only one, right? We know that, you can use something like a story alongside a strategy, alongside a traditional foresight document. And it's more effective actually when it's used in combination like that. So I'll be kind of giving you some context and talking a bit about the way that Peter and I have done this work. And similarly, you can see from, I don't know if you can read it really well, but when I was figuring out what to call this talk, I really wanted to drive home the human dimension. Mick Ryan talked about this too. It's really critical to never, amidst all this like crazy quantum technology or, new levels of autonomy and kind of human machine relationships that we're seeing every week. But like fundamentally, the human experience is what we care about, right? Because we are going to live in the future. And to see it as something that is an expression of just, technology and engineering, I think means that you can sometimes miss out on actually a really clear picture. I think this is particularly true when you think about large scale combat operations, which are obviously like one of the big discussions right now in the conventional force and also in the special operations community too, as people are trying to make sense of a way of warfare that is totally unfamiliar to the way we are like intellectually and emotionally considering conflict. Ukraine has obviously introduced some of these dimensions into the conversation in a very real way. The acuity of what the Ukrainians are going through have so many echoes for our own planning, but also for how we start to just talk about what might actually be coming down the pike as soon as 2027, if it's China, perhaps sooner somewhere else if it's Russia. So a little bit about how and why I have been working on the future of conflict through fiction. In 1986, Red Storm Rising came out. Many of you in this room are too young. Maybe you were born after that. For those of you who are of my vintage, it is likely that this book came out and you read it and you were like, this is the most fascinating thing I've read, because it's for the first time depicted like what the Third World War might look like during the Cold War in a fairly, at the time, realistic manner. And Clancy, who was an insurance salesman in the Eastern Shore of Maryland, who had a lot of clients who worked for the nuclear plant there, who'd been submariners before. It's where he got his inside dope for writing Hunt for Red October. Clancy did something really unique, though, is he tried to tell the war from as many different perspectives as possible. So fast forward, I had been working at the Wall Street Journal and left that life to pursue this very zigzag fictional path and lashed up with Peter Singer. We started thinking about like what are the big problems that people are not really understanding and preparing for, and the rise of China was one of them. Consistently back in 2013, the conversation around China was very dismissive of their technical and military prowess. It really saw them as a friend and partner, which, there has always been that potential, I think, and it just didn't go that way. That wasn't really their desire. And we wanted to try to capture some of that energy from Red Storm Rising, but yet also think about some of these new domains of warfare. And Peter having a cyber, expertise that he developed through working in some of his nonfiction books and other work, we felt like if we could talk about cyber and space as actual domains and show in a fictional sense through characters and capture people just like Red Storm Rising, then maybe we had a chance of equipping the national security community with a clearer picture of what conflict might be like. And if you could think about something bad happening, like the rise of autonomous systems in our economy, whether it's robots or software, and the economic and social displacement, if you can imagine this bad stuff happening, then maybe you can avoid it. And I tend to kind of work in this dystopian futures realm, which isn't so much that I have one of these very dark kind of demeanors. I'm a pretty upbeat person, but I like to say I'm sort of an optimist who stares into the abyss, right? Like I want to believe humans can fix the problem, which is certainly part of the message of Ghost Fleet, right? Initial defeat, but how do we respond? Burnin's a little darker book, a little more grim, but nonetheless, the human dimension comes through. I think that's really important, the sense of agency when we think and talk about the future too. Science fiction, often has been talked about as something that has been inspiring for people who are engineers, people who are in the tech sector, et cetera. And I think it has a special relevance in the national security community too, particularly as many of the technologies that we're seeing now are literally ripped from the pages of novels that we may have read a long time ago. This quote from Martin Dempsey, which was for an Atlantic Council anthology we did, I thought was a really good way to encapsulate the value to the military profession, of not just science fiction, but really reading and kind of art. To me, this aspect of being able to think about things before they happen and to be able to, as a practice, engage in that process is hugely, hugely powerful. And General Dempsey, I believe, had a master's degree in English, if I'm not mistaken, or at least an undergraduate degree, as someone who, of course, then would see that power naturally. But, how do you kind of put it in the context of the professional, military education world? How do you put it in the context of people who are doing future planning or doctrine? And, DC loves acronyms, the military loves acronyms. And so one of the kind of tongue-in-cheek ways, as I was thinking about it one day, was I'll turn it into like an int. We have human, well, why not fic int? And, the kind of initial, again, kind of humorous way I was considering it led to something that became more substantial, right? And if you imagine that, you can take something that's fictional, you can collect it, right? You can read it, you can buy it, you can watch it, you can play it. You can analyze it, we can have a discussion about it. You might hate it, but you're going to talk about it. I mean, in fact, we actually talk about the films and books we hate the most, sometimes more than the ones we love, because we're like, God, did you see that? That sucked. And then you can act on it, right? You can use these sorts of deep dives or, mental exercises to begin to kind of think through the potential implications for a given technology, a given dimension or an operating concept, et cetera. And so a lot of the work that we do with useful fiction today is working with various parts of the military and other folks to do so. And, the fundamental piece of it that's really important, though, is like a smoothie, right? It should be delicious, but it should have like kale and, vitamins or whatever in it. It should be balanced, right? So it's palatable, but also gives you something more than like just a milkshake. And so one of the ways that Pete describes it, he'll say like traditional sci-fi is certainly inspired by reality. Good sci-fi reflects the world we're in as much as the future. But good sci-fi is kind of like a milkshake, and we try to differentiate useful fiction as being more like a smoothie, right? We have a lot of kale. So in terms of the process, we spend a lot of time working with the, customer, if you will. It could be like in this case, we worked with General Brown when he was Chief of Staff of the Air Force for a Corona meeting. All the top Air Force generals get together, and as one of the read aheads for that, we produced basically a fictitious speech that was given by a chief of staff from the future who is looking back at the centennial of the Air Force, which is 2047, 2 years before China's 100th, and reflecting on a big setback in the Pacific and what the U.S. did to compensate. And the value to giving this to these other senior Air Force generals, by the chief is like putting everyone on notice. Like, I take this, war footing, aspect that I talk about all the time seriously. We have to start acting as if. And so this was one way to do that. When you're designing these things, though, that's through, research and conversation. It's through, the sort of, deep dives into subject areas where, I'm not expert in, but you try to find people who are. And you can weave that into your narrative fiction so it has that resonance. And one of the most important questions we're always thinking about is, familiar to anybody who does communications, which is like, obviously, who's your audience? And in this case, we're also thinking about what do we want them to do after? And that piece of the first step, whether it's a thought or an action, is always really critical in the conversations, almost in the hierarchy of designing a piece of fiction or useful fiction story. You're trying to have an effect. You're trying to quite literally make it useful. When we were trying to figure out what to call the entity that Peter and I used to do these projects, I kind of thought useful fiction was too on the nose. It literally is what it is. But it's a really good encapsulation, it turned out, because it leaves no mystery as to what we're up to. And in the context of, the bigger questions that are being faced right now, there's a lot of last 20 years to the next 20 discussions going on. Again, it's very acute in the special operations community, but you see it throughout the conventional force too. This is an example of a project we did at Joint Special Operations University where we blended some training exercises where we did writing workshops, futures workshops, with actual mentoring of people from the SOCOM community to write their own stories. So Peter and I wrote 4 stories in this anthology. 8 were written by folks we mentored, and we created some art for it. To do a 12-story little book that's put out by JSOW Press. You can get it on their website. It's free. But it has many of the visions of what the special operations, operating environment, personnel, mission sets, tech, are going to be like over the kind of 2030 horizon to early 2040s. And, the power of something like this too, I think speaks to the value of story and writing and being creative is that it can be crowdsourced, right? You can reach out to people who don't ordinarily enter into these conversations in ways that are really linked to their own personal experiences. So they're drawing on aspects of knowledge that they have that are both learned, but also experienced. And that kind of stuff is invaluable in informing how we look at the future. And this project, I think, is one of the highlights in that regard. Mick Ryan was also the former commander of the Australian Defence College. And one of the projects that we did for him when he was there, I got asked the other day, like, is there anything that you wouldn't write about? Or what's the most boring thing you've written about? And I, kind of thought, I was like, well, I don't think anything we've written is boring. But I did, reflect for a minute more. And for Mick, we did a short story on PME. Like, could you make fiction about PME interesting? And I think we did, right? The Australian Defence Forces have been wrestling with this question about how to, share information and transform the professional military education enterprise in an era where, models about learning are changing and technology is enabling it. It's really critical, the kind of things that have to be learned quickly in new spaces with new people. And so we were trying to make this nonfiction report, which had a lot of awesome insights, I think like 36 or 37 kind of key points, into something that could be read very broadly, not just by the core, Australian Defence College community or the staff officers, and civilians who worked on it. So we created a pretty long story, about 7,000 words, following an officer in a two-track journey, one like retrospective into her experiences in various physical and virtual learning environments, and also an operational mission that was like a non-combatant evacuation of civilians, but also some data from an embassy in an unnamed storm-lashed country where the Chinese and gangs were kind of competing for different resources at that time. And the point of this is that you want to be able to think about these really critical issues that might be particular to your subject matter expertise area. It might be really critical to the future of your organization. And you have to figure out how to get more people involved in that to find a good solution. In this case, we can look at metrics sometimes with like a wary eye, when someone's like, well, how do you know it works, right? And it's a really good question. I don't always have a good answer. But in this case, we could look at like simply like who was reading the story, An Eye for a Storm. And, I think we had like a half dozen US 4-stars read it. The Chief of Defense of Australia had like at least 15,000 downloads within a couple of weeks of being out. That's pretty good, like for a piece of content based off PME, like that's not typically the kind of response. And so I put that out there as a way just to kind of remind you that you can make almost anything interesting with the right kind of narrative around it. And what I want to shift to next is looking not just at methodology, but also areas of interest to me, and I think are really critical to explore in thinking about the future of conflict. And I can talk to you about them through some of the work we've done in these areas. And hopefully that will give you some kind of nesting in sort of my worldview, but also gives you a little bit of outside perspective. So the first one is obvious, which is like the primacy and importance of software and data, the family of technologies that we would call AI, which are hard to define sometimes. The best technology is almost invisible, and I think AI is often in that context. But none of that stuff really is going to amount to anything without the right data. This is a quote from one of the muckraking journalists at the start of the 20th century, Ida Tarbell, who really spent a lot of time diving into Standard Oil and John Rockefeller and a lot of the economics and rights issues and stuff around his business and impact on society. But what I think about this quote that's interesting, from a muckraker like this, and I use that in the positive sense, not a pejorative one, is that you can when I read that quote, I thought if you just change money with data, right, you have a really interesting kind of concise encapsulation of how important it is. And trying to make that clear to people is hard, right? How do you articulate the value of something you can't see, something that is difficult to often acquire, to share, et cetera? It's more headache than opportunity. Yet this is what people are wrestling with in DoD, right? Like every day. We actually have a data and AI office, right, that's at the Pentagon within OSD that has its mandate. And one of the projects we worked on for them last fall was they were releasing a new data strategy and AI strategy for the department. And these kinds of strategies or missives that come out of these offices, there's different ways that they can approach them. One of the really unique things about this one, and one of the challenges of this project, was that they were making it not something that had to be followed, but it was more of an opt-in approach. And because they realized the complexities of these technologies and platforms, the motivations at a human level of an SES or a program manager or an officer in charge of managing some of these systems and APIs, what is their motivation to actually follow a strategy like this? And so we thought about that and tried to get into this idea of what are the things that people in those jobs really worry about. And having been in DC for a while and worked as a journalist there in my old life, nobody likes having a GAO report written about their program. And I'd always thought it would be a really effective storytelling tool to create a fictitious one. So I finally got my long, standing wish to do a fictitious GAO report. And what was especially interesting about this is it reads like an actual GAO report, right? That's not just this cover page, which I'm showing you here. It's actually like 6 pages long. And it basically unpacks this data strategy and shows what the potential consequences are if it was not followed and where the pitfalls would be in implementing. From a design perspective, from the visual piece, which is really important to think about even when you're writing, we worked with our designer, who is excellent, Brian Payne, to kind of come up with an actual rendering so that it reads and looks just like a GAO report. But you can see from it, you have the kind of weekend reading marks on it, the coffee ring, the angry red pen. That is to kind of tap into that emotional state that someone would have in responding to something like this as a senior leader. And then you imagine being on that team and getting that. So, that duality again between like the futures we want to see and the futures we want to avoid, and trying to place someone in the middle of that. My hope is that someone who's in a Pentagon position or one of the services to make a decision on data and adhering to the strategy or following it, reads that and is like, I don't want to be that person, right? The flip side is, you want to have some aspirational pieces to it too. You want to make people feel like they can be part of the solution. And stepping back for just a quick minute, like that aspect of agency in the future is really important. Like we want to feel like we have control over our future. We want to feel like we don't just live in like a swipe and, kind of app-driven world. And it gets harder, right? Because we have more and more different elements of our lives that are really almost like, feels like predetermined, both from a design, but also from like a code and data perspective. But here, at least, in this kind of fictitious transcript and press release for a data scientist in the Army who helped come up with a really, innovative management tool that helped prevail in a conflict in Northern Europe, we tried to show the inverse of this, very, very salacious GAO report. Rather that, there are people who are going to do, innovative and even brave things, at the bureaucratic level, right, to make these kinds of futures happen. Because fundamentally, this is something that we're all living with today, right? I mean, this is, the Strava heat map that went, viral a little while ago from, Horn of Africa there in Djibouti, right? From, personal devices like Garmin's. And, we're in this ubiquitous surveillance world. We're in this world where you can triangulate activity and location from, IoT, Internet of Things devices that are off our bodies. You have to be kind of acting as if you're under surveillance at all times. And, that's true when people are back home, or it's certainly even more so when they're overseas. But this ubiquity of data and the inability to almost do anything about it goes back to this question of agency. It can feel like it's overwhelming. And from a human dimension, a character perspective, you're constantly thinking about, how do I help someone feel like they have a choice and can navigate their way through? The flip side of that agency piece too is, out of Ukraine, seeing the ability to give an average civilian the tools to, introduce targeting information into, a government kind of kill chain, basically. And, there's many other tools beyond this one, but the point is we're at this era where the paradigms are totally inverting and they're way more dynamic than in many cases we've been used to. And yet that cycle and that kind of complexity is only going to increase. And it's not just going to be in areas that are immediately familiar. We're starting to see it in emergent, aspects of conflict, like what I would call cognitive warfare, which is, something that is, emergent, but increasingly important. So, I would define cognitive warfare as basically like, the high ground is no longer like a ridgeline, but it's like what's between people's ears. And that, of course, means you're including elements of psychological operations or info ops or, biologics, all kinds of things that will be shaping how we control, rather how we manage, communicating and connecting with people, or from an adversary perspective, how do you target individuals at scale, right? And, the data sciences and things that I just was talking about will allow that now and are beginning to make that even more efficient and increasingly autonomous. I get a little bit of like the tinfoil hat look when I talk to people about this sometimes, but for those of you, it's like if you kind of have that light switch go off, or if you've seen, evidence of this, it is really, really, I think, clarifying and introducing another dimension to conflict, that's already here and is going to become more and more regularized. Just like Mick Ryan is talking about deep strike capabilities being, democratized is maybe the word I'd use, like, the Houthis can accomplish. Similarly, these campaigns also, as compute power gets cheaper, as data gets more accessible and easier to buy on the open market, you're going to be able to target and have influence and effects on the battlefield and off well before conflicts actually begin, perhaps even superseding or preceding conflicts. That is going to be really, really difficult to see a way around. One of the challenges for NATO, particularly where I've worked on some of this, is, as a defensive organization, basically, how do you approach it, right? Because it is tied up in all kinds of really complex ethical and legal issues. But fundamentally, the conversations about societal resiliency at this almost cognitive level, I think, are really important and are going to be more and more endemic to understanding future warfare and future scenarios, that if you don't pay attention to this, you risk potentially being blindsided up to it. I think what's going on in the continent of Africa right now in various countries, where the Russians are getting heavily more involved, is showing that, if we take our eyes off the ball, not just kind of tactically, but also in this domain, you can lose ground really quickly. Similarly, the Chinese are, very vocal about the importance of cognitive warfare. They're not hiding it. They're investing in it. They're basically training people for it and are trying to begin to find a way to introduce it operationally. And places like Taiwan would obviously be the sort of contingency or scenario that have that potential to go from something that's localized to large scale really quite quickly. depending on how we respond. And I think being aware of these elements that can be seen as either like precursor activities or may actually be the main effort. You might have, modalities of conflict that actually see a lot of these campaigns being shaped by kinetic or IRL activities. And that's an inversion too, because you'd usually think about something like that as support, right? An information campaign. But you may actually see the shaping being done by kinetic or physical activities, cyber maybe too, to create kind of social and emotional and conditions and such. I mean, as one of the things that the Colonial Pipeline hack of a few years ago, 4 years ago, one of the things that most disturbed me, and this is my like dystopian hat being put on, was that with available open source information from cell phone data, credit card receipts, you could track a lot of other stuff too on the open market with data brokers. You could see after that hack who responded irrationally, like literally you could see who, to the loss potentially of fuel supplies in the East Coast. So to some extent, the hack mattered because it showed the vulnerabilities in this vital system. But to me, the real strategic value is I now know a good portion of the Americans who I can potentially nudge and shape, right, in a crisis. And I did it really inexpensively with a cyber attack. But again, by having the data to overlay over the human, activities of people that I may want to panic or align or move an IRL, in a different kind of conflict in the future. To me, that piece of a hack like that has an infrastructure element is really, really critical to see as potentially being useful in these more complex operations. Again, it's a little bit tinfoil hat, but that's just the way I think conflict is going. And when I can't not have that kind of thought about the second and third order effects, not as ancillary, but more primary, right? Like what are you building towards with that data? Again, it's a hard thing to write about and to talk about. I've used fiction to do it, and this was a story that was published publicly, still there. The other ones are not public, but we have to find ways to start talking about these things that don't sound like crazy, that allow us to kind of begin to shape and include them in things like operational planning or technologies that we're going to be using. Because we know with things like VR, which are coming, you're going to be able to reach and influence people in manners that are going to be more intense and emotional, possibly, than anything we've seen before. Similarly, the ability to organize, whether it is for regular warfare type activities through, blockchain-like or kind of, let's say, disaggregated or asynchronous communities that can make decisions collectively from far distributed geographies is really also quite interesting too in this context of being able to connect people at that, cognitive level. But, a lot of the conversation about future war is taken up by, things with wings, right? Robots. Drones, and rightfully so. The tension that I see not quite being adjudicated yet is the economic piece. And, this is my old, again, defense, kind of procurement, writing and things that I did about acquisitions and contracting. There is a real disinterest in playing in this space by the biggest companies that are, in the defense market. And so you're seeing the rise of startups, but the question is, can any of this scale, right? The mass production, like we're seeing in Ukraine of small drones, if they're going from 1 million this year to 2 million next year, as Mick was noting today, does the U.S. defense industrial base have the will to do something like that? It's a really good and open question, right? I don't know. And it's critical, though, to try to understand where the parameters are, where the motivations and incentives are, because we know with small drones, they're going to become more ubiquitous. We know big drones have that potential to be ubiquitous, but only if the economics are sorted out. The impact, too, isn't just on the kinetic side. As many of you were talking about already on the sidelines of the conference here, the kinetic and kind of attack aspect of one-way drones, FPV drones going after personnel or tanks is proven. The other piece of it that I think is worth pointing out too is that how we see and understand from an information or even just experiential perspective, warfare is heavily shaped in Ukraine by the drone's eye view, right? And I think as we get more time passing between the start of that conflict and we step back and look at the totality of how we understand it, particularly for those of us who are not in Ukraine, that drone's eye view is increasingly going to be, I think, one of the signature hallmarks of like the experience. With time, we'll see more of that. At the same time, we're still trying to make sense of some of the fundamentals. For those of you who are familiar with the OODA loop from John Boyd, I would assume, yes. I think we also have to kind of start to reconsider this question of autonomy and control. the conversations around things like the third offset strategy, which were basically passed, obviously, but introduced the discussion about humans who are in the loop, right? Are we actually, telling machines yes or no, or on the loop, more supervisory? And I don't think really either of those are actually very likely or practical when you start to anticipate the kinds of large-scale combat operations engagements where distance and degraded communications and other aspects of control and command are going to be, so acute that you're basically going to have to trust systems to do their jobs on their own, just like you're going to have to trust people to do their jobs on their own. So the kind of Clausewitzian, aspect of mission command, has the same dynamic with machines. It comes down to trust. But the Boyd loop kind of goes onto almost just like an orient act dyad, right? It just spins because the decision, is basically automated. The observe is certainly automated. So if a human is to have any kind of, hope of being on the loop or maybe just tapping a flywheel along, if you will, it is maybe in the orientation of systems, right? And then kind of giving them some sort of selections of choices to make about how to act. But ultimately, those decisions themselves are going to be made by machines at that, hyper war speed of warfare, as writers like Amir Hussein have called it. I think that's really important to understand. At the same time, too, like there's this moment of almost mystery. We have new GPT, edition that just came out. For those of you who have played with some of the early image generators like Stable Diffusion and others, there's a lot of weird ethereal stuff. And this was some, some AI-driven writing that I had created because I was really curious about how machines might memorialize machines, right? What would AI think of like loss when a drone is shot down or crashes, et cetera? It's a bit of an esoteric exploration, but like super interesting to me. And so this was some of the language that was given to me by one of the earlier GPTs. And it's like got that weird spooky, aspect to it that I think is a really important reminder, just like when you have to stop and say, there is so much we don't actually understand about many of these systems that are based on neural nets and other machine learning, et cetera. And I think that is hard because we're at a point where programs of record are being created, billions of dollars are being committed, careers are being, tracked according to some of these systems. And yet it's almost like building airplanes and not understanding the physics of flight, and many of the data scientists that work on translational tools and stuff, they don't know how this stuff works. I mean, the guys who built Google Translate, I don't think still really know how the current version works, right? So to me, being able to kind of hold that intention to be like, we have to have certainty about the importance, but still not totally understand it is very, very difficult, but really, really critical. And again, I think something that the creative community and writing in particular can be good at exploring. Because we're here at Fort Campbell, this aspect of SOF is something I thought that was worth talking about too, because I think it touches on a lot of different aspects on military transformation and culture, which are really, really important to try to understand when you're looking out at a future conflict scenario and trying to see it through a human perspective. These questions of culture and identity are massively important. And, this kind of fundamental question about, valor and heroism in the machine age, in this software-driven era, is a really important question too. Will we decorate machines, right? Can people who code, be considered for military citations in the way that someone who might have charged a bunker once was? This is the French painter, I think it's Jean-Louis David from early 19th century. This is Oath of the Horatiites, one of the classic kind of martial, classic, realism paintings from this era. And to me, it's like the embodiment of, what the noble ideal of like what a warrior and brotherhood is, right? This is a very Western picture of that. And yet we're now in this era, particularly in special operations, of like the BVR era, like beyond visual range. It's early. The Sparrow missile introduced, here flown on a prop plane, not a jet, but in 1954, I think it was, gave pilots the ability to shoot down aircraft, that they couldn't see basically, still put guns on planes for, actual, if not kind of, legacy reasons. But the point is, aviation had a very long transformational period that the weapons changed, the platforms too, the sensors and other systems around that, as did the culture and the people. And I think the soft question about the future of special operations is also interesting in this regard, because so many effects now can happen from, across the world, they're orbital, et cetera. Yet we also know the criticality of this human to human connection, whether it is in conflict or whether it is in partnership. We can't say that that's going away, because we know, if anything, it's becoming more important. So again, just like, some of these other things you have to kind of hold in tension, this is another really important one. Being able to kind of look at this evolution of this like Sparrow era and understanding that it is going to develop at a pace that we don't totally understand. It's going to have second and third order effects that will, again, touch upon these other areas, like I said, of platforms and training, et cetera. But also those kind of basic core elements of what it means to serve, to be a warrior, a hero, what is valor. We're going to reconsider them, but also still kind of probably revert back to those means. Also, this notion of like, who is a special operator? And these are British Special Boat Service members. They look like they're on a drunken fishing trip, but they're in Crete, in 1943. This is a very different picture of like what we think of a special operator today. But yet many of those fundamentals to those missions, right, to the aspects of courage, of planning, of comradeship, of teamwork, those have continuities that will continue. Soft truths, being one of the kind of currencies, if you will, of identity and culture. The way that's, SOCOM can basically say, we are different than a conventional force. And these are some of the aspects, right? Less so, perhaps, but I think there's an updating that's necessary for this. And again, I'm just a civilian, just a writer here, but, starting to play with some of this in an active way, I think is really important, right? How do you redefine those core tenets in this era, in this, BVR, the Sparrow era, whatever you want to call it, yet recognizing the long arcs and continuities at the same time. The software eating the world, aphorism has been out for a while now. It's just as true as ever. Certainly impacts special operations at every level. Similarly, we can't ignore the power of robotics and other systems, right, that we're going to have to count on in ways maybe even trust more so than fellow humans, because it's often harder to build machine trust. The special operations force of the future, maybe even smaller than it is today. And that is paradoxical with like needing more of that capability and talent. And so how do you then think about not the people, but what happens, right? What's their effect? What is their true kind of capacity or capability? What role do machines and software play in kind of going into Mick Ryan's notion of reconsidering the notion of mass, right? How do we expand that by yet maybe even having fewer people, whether that's because of retention issues or recruiting issues, or whether it's by choice, right? Because of the threat environment. Similarly, you can't rush to the fire because of, in the Pacific particularly, you have to kind of be there when it breaks out. And that doesn't mean just physically being there, but it means being there in a digital sense, whether it's from a data point of view or a local connection point of view, and maintaining those with some of the technology and tools we have. The point is that being in place is going to matter more and more. Part of it is the threat to sea lines and communication, for example, again, going across the Pacific. But some of it is also just the intensity of the efficacy of the relationships that people are going to have to deal with large-scale combat operations isn't something that you can kind of show up and just conjure out of thin air. It's not going to be possible. And then lastly, the idea of whether it's the enabler conversation or whatever the right vernacular or language will be over the next 5 to 10 years about the totality of a team that gets something audacious and very difficult done. Is a really important reconsideration too. And even if the soft community says it wants to bring all that in, like it is going to need to be reaching out probably more than ever. And that's not just within the government, but in the civilian sector, in the non-governmental sector. And so that kind of web of connection and people is going to be very, very critical to consider realistically about who's willing, who's interested, and who's able to be parts of those almost like vectors to get stuff done, right? Especially in very dangerous and denied environments. One of the really interesting, ways that we've been able to explore some of this is through working with the Marine Raiders, who have been developing their concepts. And because the Raiders are kind of constantly reimagining, what is going to be the mission set and the possibility, they've been using fiction as well. And so similarly to the JSOW project I mentioned, we did something similar where Peter and I did some writing ourselves on some of their operating concepts, but also mentored some of their special operations officers, Raider officers, who also took on different aspects of the 2040 operating environment and used fiction as a way to have a conversation about that. So then, The reason why something like this is value is if you're in that smaller community, you can then go to, say, a bigger institution or entity like SOCOM and say, hey, this is how we're thinking about the operating environment, about what a future raider may do. And you can start to have a conversation with that as the beginning point, right? Any story isn't like the end of a conversation. It's an opening or introduction to further discussion, ideally. The last kind of 3 technology areas I want to talk about, first is commercial space. And, I think this is interesting because of its ubiquity and its obviously military relevance. Ukraine, as anything, has shown that our ability to look at modern warfare without the integral role of commercial space, you can't untangle them anymore. This idea of Maxar, for example, being a military target is a really interesting question. You have different commercial entities who have been seen by the Russians as valid military targets for hacking. At some point, when you look at the larger complex piece of the space economy on the commercial side, the fiction writer in me, the one who's been working on these kinds of narratives, is starting to look at like every aspect of space that happens, in orbit has a terrestrial component, right? And so from the military kind of concept and operations perspective, where are the ground stations that are critically important, like they are in Espacio Lejano in Argentina? Where are the launch facilities that we're going to have to be mindful of, either preserving access to, controlling, or denying? All of that is going to be vital. At the same time, too, miniaturization of small sats and micro sats lately, which is the latest, kind of miniaturization trend, portends a lot more kind of equal distribution of these kinds of capabilities within our forces. It may be, at the battalion level, do you have your own microsats? Does the launch capacity and innovation that we see, the cheaper and cheaper per, kilogram payload prices begin to introduce that? Or will the other alternative means to get these sorts of systems into space so that ubiquitous surveillance or communications that is going to be so critical when bigger systems are offline in big combat operations, you're going to have to kind of see that level of innovation, which is, probably pretty difficult bureaucratically and budgetarily, but the exigencies of these kinds of scenarios, Taiwan or something more, like that in the Philippines, may require it. The last thing I would say about space too is that as someone who's always kind of looking for opportunities to understand the future in a positive way, I think there is a really interesting movement in the new space economy of reimagining what's possible, so that like we are seeing companies developing, we are seeing new actors in space that are using data for good on Earth, whether it is for climate protection, whether it is for disaster response, whether it is for education, or sustaining, a fragile food infrastructure in a given region. So part of my hope is that, space, if anything, though it has this incredibly relevant military aspect, commercial space, that it also is potentially an opportunity for collaboration and hope. And, I don't mean to, get too TED Talk about that, but I feel like it is something that we have to always think about in those sorts of on-ramps and off-ramps and conflicts and de-escalation and escalation as being one of those places. This is from a project we did for a group called Inter-Astra, which Charlie Bolden, the former NASA administrator and Marine general, and his son, Che Bolden, who's a Marine aviator, have started, which is to kind of create a more equitable, more sustainable, and ultimately more resilient space economy than just a bunch of billionaires kind of pioneering, their way to the stars. And these sorts of new innovation models, which are looking, again, very grassroots at technology and kind of a founder level aspect of innovation, have, massive national security implications, because that's kind of innovation that really like what we need in this country, given the criticality of space. But also, it gives you something to be kind of hopeful for. Back to my dystopian pessimistic point of view, though, when I look at things like gene modification and some of the abilities to weaponize many of these breakthroughs, this was a piece of art I made with one of the AI image engines. We have now almost like the biological corollary to what I was talking about with cognitive warfare of targeting individuals at scale. The amount of genetic information that's easily, retrievable, modelable, with incredibly powerful compute, scares the heck out of me. It's one of the things that keeps me up at night. Why do we worry about something like this, which seems like it could be, worrying about getting struck by lightning, when you're going hiking or something? Because the technology is going to begin to coalesce around giving this capability to a greater and greater number of people and within the hands of big nation states that are looking for asymmetric advantage, this is going to have to be for them, I think, one of the first places they look. And just like with other, kind of strategic or national, level weapons, that doesn't mean that this is something that is going to be a first choice, but I think it is going to be increasingly something you have to think about, not just in a sci-fi, dystopian way, but rather that it is potentially going to shape the operating environment of the future. When you can potentially keep militaries from deploying to certain areas or targeting members of a society that are supporting a war effort at scale, but again, with great precision due to gene drive type weapons, it's something that, again, sounds like sci-fi stuff, but is certainly within the realm of potential and technologies today that are really important to pay attention to. We've seen it with the weaponization of tools and models that are used to create medicines can also create terrible, terrible bioweapons with just the same speed. And the machine doesn't care what it's making, right? I mean, there's no kind of limit on sort of the destructive capability in a model like that, right? That's really up to the people who are using that model and that data. And as we know, there are plenty of people who will take that elsewhere. Quantum computing, is always one of these technologies that is around the corner, but I feel like some of the gene drive and biotechnology capabilities has the potential to fundamentally change like a before and an after moment for the world. This is from a project we did for NATO Allied Command Transformation about the idea of a not quantum decryption moment, but rather a quantum encryption moment. So a lot of worry already and investing is going into creating kind of post-quantum cryptography, right? How do you code and protect stuff today so that if the Chinese are revealed to have, a massive code-breaking quantum, engine and kind of compute, center, that you can still have secrets. But the flip side of that is, this is for this project, we wanted to imagine, what if like an individual could have the level of cryptology that was unbreakable? What would that mean for the era of like total secrecy, and then if this was open sourced, what does that mean if our adversaries get that? What if we can no longer look inside or behind, the curtain with them? Part of the advantage, though, isn't just in things like cryptography. It's funny coming at this from like a layperson's perspective and talking to quantum scientists, particularly working on and thinking about military applications. The ability to change things like sensing so that really difficult missions like, the kind of underground hard target defeat type stuff. What if you could actually see through 500 feet of solid Earth, because you have quantum sensors, quantum powered enhancement for sensors and other forms of data that would let you look from space, for example, and have that level of fidelity and resolution. Again, science fiction today, but getting closer and closer when those quantum breakthroughs happen. We know, though, these are difficult technologies to wrestle with. They are not easy to produce in ways that are sustainable or scalable. I mean, a quantum computer is $1 billion, and trying to create a quantum startup is one of the hardest, businesses probably to get into because of some of these kind of engineering cliffs you have to scale. But that doesn't mean that you might not wake up one day and some of these things are true. And, I think the best thing when you're dealing with, whether it's bio, whether it's quantum, whether some of the commercial space stuff, these kind of three out there technologies, is at least being kind of mentally prepared for that moment when that may happen. I'm ready to take some questions in the 10 minutes or so we have left, but I appreciate your interest and thanks for coming down to the front of the room after lunch. And I don't think anybody fell asleep, so I think I'm winning today. Thank you.
All right, we'd like to open up to questions. Anybody have any questions for August?
I was super interested mostly in the cognitive domain that you were talking about, so I want to dive into that a little bit deeper. In my experience, I noticed that the cognitive domain really impacts humans and information, especially for U.S. partners in foreign places. And what we recognized was a lot of information pollution, is what we dubbed it. Is because adversaries were pumping mis, and disinformation into the information space and influencing the people that we wanted to influence, quite frankly. And so how do you see that we can get ahead in the cognitive domain and identify our adversaries in that same space and defeat those types of things?
Yeah, that's in many ways one of the I think, best ways to approach the question, because there's both an offensive and a defensive conversation around cognitive warfare. And I think from our values perspective, or even a NATO alliance point of view, it is probably easier and more valuable to look at things from a defensive point of view. How do you protect a society? And in the case of, societies which have militaries that reflect that society and its members, can you begin to think about that in kind of hardening, if you will, or maybe that's not the right word, but making more resilient to those kinds of, mal, mis, and disinformation campaigns, starting with education when people are young and creating a level of, I don't even mean sophistication, but awareness about A, this is a threat, B, this is something that we're going to see more of. That would probably help people for a civil society sense, because many of those same tactics are being used in commercial marketing online and manipulation of, kind of our emotional energy for to make us buy stuff or click, left or right on things. So I think I would probably look at it from like an educational point of view, because that's probably one of the cheapest ways. There's, from a technology point of view, it's very difficult. At the same time, I think I would think about situational awareness. That's something I'm thinking a lot about right now. How do you create situational awareness in an operating environment where a cognitive campaign may be the primary way an adversary is trying to get something done, right? So that doesn't mean I can just look at like an iPhone screen, but how, even in a tactical sense, do I understand if I go into this neighborhood, this has been heavily campaigned against in the last, 20 minutes or 20 hours or 20 days or 20 years, maybe in some adversary sense. But if I go over here, I'm going to be okay. And thinking about what are the kind of models and then how to take that information and communicate it to an individual. Are we going to have to think about the ability of the human body to understand what's going on around us in a battle space that's going to be very complicated with flying things? There's electromagnetic spectrum, there's kinetic threats, simple stuff like mines or artillery, but you have to worry about these other dimensions. Do we have to kind of reconsider the human machine or human data interface? So are things like haptics going to be more important? Looking at virtual and augmented reality? I totally think so. To create kind of a situational awareness at an individual, if not like unit or larger level, is going to be really, really important too. Because I think it's easy to look at it from like, oh, this is a data problem. Like a up kind of esoteric almost. We just got to like analyze the right data and have the right model, and we can, create counter campaigns autonomously. But like, then you have to think about what are you going to do with that information operationally in a tactical sense? And I think that last piece gets ignored a lot because it's really squishy. It's like grasping smoke. But the CA, the PSYOP community, even the SF community too, right? Those are all extremely relevant questions when you're working with partner forces, when you're trying to understand an environment before things break out, or maybe deterring, ideally, right? So I think that defensive threat is the one to pull.
We have any other questions?
Major Rob Calkins, sir, the Division Artillery S2. So in my limited experience at the tactical level, at least I've been in conventional tactical most of my career, I've yet to see a lot of leaders that see the value in fictional intelligence, to use your term. Have you seen something different from your experience at the tactical level? And how do I get my leaders to understand the value of these, alternate scenarios of the future over?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of it is bottom up or like top down. You might have like a senior leader who's like saying everyone needs to read and write, which is, I think, good advice. Or you might have a squad leader or even a platoon leader who wants to make sure that the awareness of, say, the importance of cyber, in a tactical sense is going to be shared maybe through, reading a short story or something like that. But we're still in a very early era, in all this. And I think back to some of the Atlantic Council work I did with Art of Future Warfare, right around when Ghost Fleet came out around 2016, it took a while for that to kind of take hold. And even though we have books like Ghost Fleet and other fictional titles now increasingly, more like feature fiction on PME lists and being taught, I think that's a start. But, the larger, Leo said, 3 million people in the whole national security enterprise for DoD. Think about the numbers and scale, right? So it's not going to be the solution for everything. However, I think the more you read, the more you read. And I think the more it is at that grassroots level shared and then coming down from on high, over time, people will, I think, begin to see it as having value. And it's not just reading, but also writing. and going through some of those exercises. We're lucky enough to get to run these trainings, and you can see people tackling, the question of how to understand an operating environment or scenario through a character-driven perspective, which may seem totally, orthogonal or not relevant to like the normal ways of going about doing it. But after a couple hours of trying to crack that and talking about that narrative with your peers, like you do have a different level of communicating around it. You might understand it differently. And so that's sort of the hope, is that it's both scale, a book that goes through that can be read widely, but then also finding, opportunities and within, within your kind of work and your life, finding ways to kind of share and push that out too. It's certainly, not part of the ordinary playbook, but more and more. I mean, my hope is that, it will become something that is less of a like big deal because more people are doing it.
I'm Corporal Rex Payton, also with the RDS2. I was wondering if you could see, like, in the cognitive realm for the defensive position, if you could see utilization of physical ephemera as like a short-term solution to some of the information pollution that was mentioned earlier.
Oh, interesting. I hadn't thought about that. I don't know. Tell me more about that, actually. That's an interesting idea.
I was just thinking along the lines of, if the information that's being polluted out is going through social media and digital media of sorts, physical ephemera could show pictures or images that were previously edited on social media, could be used as like a sort of way around that to get a piece of information that's unable to be modified by the adversary in the moment.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool idea. One of the expressions of that is the notion of like a propaganda poster in the VR era, to be able to slap on a wall with to glue it on there in the, kind of old school, way, rock concert promoter, in the middle of the night. But what if that is the best way to actually, as you say, someone can obviously paint over it, but like, if you know that you don't trust anything that's coming into your viz feed or you're seeing on your phone, but if you're getting nudged or kind of shaped a little bit by things that you see in the real world, I think there's value to that. There's an interesting, corollary. John Steinbeck, the famous American writer, wrote A Moon is Down, which is about the German occupation of Norway and the resistance. And, the idea behind that was to create a narrative about resistance, right? That could be, it was funded by the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, that could be shared within occupied Europe in a manner that was not going to be like a radio broadcast jammable or triangulatable, as the case in occupied Norway. And so having things like that are distributable and shareable and discussable is a really interesting way to think about, almost that information or cognitive piece of, like, say, starting resistance movements. That we're going to have to be very creative about doing so. And I love the idea of like kind of using physical, ephemera, as you said, to do that.
All right, have we got anything else out there? All right, August, thank you.
Thank you all
let's give a round of applause
coming.
real quick, and then we'll move into our last break. Welcome back. We're going to move into the final portion of today's briefs discussions. We're going to quickly go over the Civil Military Innovation Institute kind of structure and what we are and what we're not. We're going to go over some of the programs that we run, some of the opportunities that we present, and just kind of talk about how we at CMI2 work in the innovation space and how we kind of take all the things that we've talked about today and kind of turn them into realities for the warfighter. So the Civil Military Innovation Institute is a 501c3 based out of Morgantown, West Virginia. We focus on fostering tactical level, soldier-driven innovation. So we partner at the unit level, not just here, but at other locations that we'll get into. And we work to take soldier ideas and help foster those, create them, curate them, get them in the right hands, get them into R&D, and get that development out there so the soldiers can get what they need, what they see the problem is down at the tactical level. Over 50% of our staff is current or former military. We know that experience matters. We know that those years that you all have put in, if you get out and go on and apply it and stay in the strategy, stay in the strategic ecosystem, you're keeping that knowledge alive, you're keeping it out there, and that's what CMI2 focuses on, and bringing the brightest that we can find that have been in the fight for the last 20 years, the last 10 years, whatever, and being able to continue to apply it to the problems that are facing our nation. We have those that aren't military. We have expertise in the engineering space. We have technical expertise. We have, a wide gambit of people that can bring things that we need together in order to put these projects into play. One of the key aspects of Civil Military Innovation Institute and the way that we work is we embed directly at the unit level. We embed in with the soldiers. For example, all of you here, we work here at the Eagle Works building. We work with the 101st. We work with all the brigade innovation officers that are tied into all the happenings at the 101st. We work with 5th Special Forces Group here. We work with some of the other special operations units at the tactical level. So as those problems arise, we can help capture those problems in order to try to find those solutions. Current locations, as you can see, we're kind of spread out and we're constantly expanding. We have, our larger locations here at Fort Campbell. We have Fort Liberty partnered with the 82nd and with 3rd Special Forces Group. We have Fort Stewart and the Marne Innovation Lab with 3rd ID. We have partnerships with various National Guard elements across the country. We're moving up into New York. We have opened up Alabama, so it's constantly growing. The network's building, and we're expanding and kind of touching as many problem sets as we can to help, like Dr. Blanken said, help spread that knowledge out and try to tie everyone together. We currently work with the kind of across all the branches. We are a Army-based program with Army Research Lab, but we do touch a lot of the different services out there and try to curate those problems, because some of the issues or the problems that get brought into us kind of answer the mail for multiple services. It's not just always an Army thing or a Navy thing. Some of it kind of crosses those streams. The CMI2 5 pillars, one, we provide that bridge between academia and DoD. We partner with academic institutions across the nation. Here are, for example, here at the Fort Campbell area, our main partnership is with Vanderbilt. We partner with the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, University of Alabama, Huntsville. So we spread out and we work with those academic institutions where a lot of that knowledge, that engineering knowledge, that expertise is resident, and try to get them connected with the soldiers so we can get those problems curated. Like I mentioned already, we work with the frontline soldiers. We are attached at the unit levels. We provide a niche experimentation and training facility. We'll get more into that, but we have a facility out in West Virginia that we use for our experimentation training events that we host out there. We also have a separate program that we work under where we incubate kind of the startup company ecosystem. We execute the deal flow of intellectual property, and we help try to make those new and coming technologies that we see as relevant, that we see that soldiers are asking for, and try to turn them into, something that can go out and get broader program of record or whatever funding stream we can get them under to get it out so everybody gets what they need. And lastly, the enablement of economic development. So, our main hub is in West Virginia. Some of the areas out there are not the economic tip of the spear, if you will, but our partnerships and the opportunities that we bring in, we're able to help kind of prop those areas up and bring more business in. So for me, like I said, I work under the Catalyst Pathfinder program, which is what I'm going to discuss here. The Catalyst side of it is a software application. You can get with me after this, or you can get on our website and take a look. You can scan the QR code, jump on there. It's open for DoD users to submit their problems that they're seeing. We take those problems on the software and we'll identify it, kind of curate it, go over with the units that we're partnered with, and kind of rack and stack them in order of precedence of what the command is looking for in order to kind of prioritize how we want to solve the issues. On the Pathfinder side of it, which is for my role with the company as an innovation chief, whenever we have a project that comes in that might be something we can't handle in-house in our maker spaces, we have to go out and find industry partners. We have to go find academic partners, like I mentioned, and we try to find those connective tissues so we can get them through that R&D dollars to get out there and start building these projects for us. Another program that we have through ARL is called Accelerating Force. This is that kind of incubation, curation aspect of it. So they take existing capabilities for maybe, new startup type companies or projects that have turned into something that is looking for a home and looking for a way to get progressed, and we will take them and try to get them in the hands of the soldiers, get them tested, get them fielded, and take them from that startup phase into the final phase of where they need to be to become program of record or long-term funding streams. Facilities. At each of our main locations, we have what we call DIRT labs, design, innovation, research, and technology. These are our maker spaces. We're sitting, for those in the crowd, right next door to EagleWorks is one of our main hubs. The goal in these is to set up locations that soldiers can come in, they can get their hands on equipment, they can take those ideas, get them on whiteboards. We'll have the expertise that works for CMI2 in-house that's going to help them take it, computer-aided design, graphics, create the thing, 3D print it, whatever we have to do to get into that final product prototype. We'll go over some of the actual facilities that we have just for everyone's knowledge, but the Fort Campbell Applied Tactical Innovation Center, the ATTIC, that's EagleWorks, has additive manufacturing, subtractive manufacturing, electrical engineering type equipment, textile crafting. We've built everything from new heavy machine gun type bags in-house, and with local industry partners, we've built small 3D printed type, antenna mounts for vehicles. We've built a 60 millimeter mortar accessory kit that some soldier came in with the good ideas on what to build. So we can kind of really span the scope of from the little small nuanced idea that's only going to impact a handful of soldiers that we can build in-house to the larger thing that could be DoD wide, that we can maybe start the prototype in-house and then transition it to a bigger scale industry partner or academic partner to get it going. The tactical operations related to cybersecurity hub, the Torch facility. This is in Morgantown, West Virginia at our headquarters. This is in partnership with US Cybercom, but this is a physical and logistical support infrastructure environment as it relates to cyber. It's a facility that they have set up that soldiers come in and train, learn how to do defensive infrastructure, cybersecurity type tasks. They have a whole model set that soldiers can come in and learn how to operate on, work. It's got train tracks and all the things that they can work and try to figure out how to operate defensively in that environment. If you need any more additional information on that kind of stuff, just get a hold of me after this. Fort Liberty Airborne Innovation Lab, the AIL, similar to our structure here at EagleWorks. They partner with the 82nd Airborne and with 3rd Special Forces Group, and then Fort Stewart Marne Innovation Center with 3rd ID. Going through those kind of quick because they're all similar capabilities across the board. The adaptive experimentation facility, this is what I kind of got into briefly before, but this is located in Clay County, West Virginia. This is our training area that we host units out there. We've had the 101st out there a few times. We've had some other partners come out, but essentially units can come out there and train on whatever tasks they need to work on. We will then integrate new technologies through DevCom, through Army Research Labs. We'll bring out projects that either that unit has sponsored or the other units are sponsored that need that operational testing, that field testing, and let them actually come out there and get their hands on and kind of that, the concept that I was talking earlier about, really pushing the envelope on the content, context, and the new technology integration, the new tactic development. This is the place to do it. It's a controlled environment that doesn't have a pass-fail type structure on the end of it, but units can come out and really work on those new divergent capabilities and structures. Dirt Days is the overall kind of structure of the event that we host out there that DevCom puts on for us. That's where they bring all the new technologies out for units to get their hands on and kind of, field and play with. So I know that was kind of quick and down and dirty. It's getting late in the day, so I wanted to make it get through that as fast as I can. Do we have any questions on Civil Military Innovation Institute before I kind of wrap this up? Okay. So first, I want to thank everyone for coming out today. I want to thank everybody for dialing in today. I think we had a fantastic event. We had a fantastic panel of experts. I appreciate you all coming out and taking your time in order to talk to us. From Dr. Blanken talking about distributed innovation and seeing how the different nodes that are out there, like ours, is working on the innovation space and building new capabilities and, finding better ways and finding that proper structure to tie into all the other lights on the Christmas tree and find that central hub that kind of ties them all together. For General Ryan for calling in and talking about the new realities and the things that he's seeing over in Ukraine right now. Can't stress enough the televised or social mediaized battle lab that we're able to witness right now. I think is kind of unprecedented in military and how we see and how we can watch what's happening in real time and how we should be able to use that to shape what we're looking at. To August for the fictional intelligence side, being able to take that narrative and pushing the narrative on what could be and what could happen in the future, taking that to drive change in our own organizations. And then, I spoke on the tactical innovation and how the progression can go from just a good idea on the tactical side to creating new tactics and new divergent operational concepts. So the last thing I wanted to kind of close with here, and I know nobody's ready to leave because you've had such a good time, but in April of 2001, the Quadrennial Defense Review, which is a document that outlines strategic objectives and potential military threats, was published. Linton Wells, he was a former naval officer and principal deputy assistant secretary of defense. He penned a memo that he attached to the report. Whether as a scathing remark against the report or as a reminder that trying to predict far into the future is a kind of an impossible task. But he penned the memo, attached it, and in the memo it broke down essentially the state of the world in 10-year increments starting in 1900. I'd like to read it for you real quick and then we'll wrap this up. So if you had been a security policymaker in the world's greatest power in 1900, you would have been British, looking warily at your age-old enemy, France. By 1910, you'd be allied with France and your enemy would be Germany. By 1920, World War I would have been fought and won, and you'd be engaged in a naval arms race with your erstwhile allies, the US and Japan. By 1930, naval arms limitation treaties were in effect, the Great Depression was underway, and the defense planning standard said no war for 10 years. 9 years later, World War II has begun. By 1950, Britain no longer is the world's greatest power. The atomic age has dawned and a police action is underway in Korea. 10 years later, the political focus was on the missile gap. The strategic paradigm was shifting from massive retaliation to flexible response, and few people had heard of Vietnam. By 1970, the peak of our involvement in Vietnam had come and gone. We were beginning détente with the Soviets, and we were anointing the Shah as our protege in the Gulf. By 1980, the Soviets were in Afghanistan. Iran was in the throes of revolution. There was talk of the U.S. hollow forces and a window of vulnerability. The U.S. was the greatest creditor nation the world had ever seen. By 1990, the Soviet Union was within a year of dissolution. American forces in the desert were on the verge of showing they were anything but hollow, and the U.S. had become the greatest debtor nation the world had ever known. And almost no one had heard of the internet. 10 years later, Warsaw was the capital of a NATO nation. Asymmetric threats transcended geography, and the parallel revolutions of information, biotech, robotics, nanotech, and high-density energy sources foreshadowed changes almost beyond forecasting. He ended his memo with this quote: all of this which to say is that I'm not sure what 2010 will look like, but I'm sure that it'll be very little like we expect, so we should plan accordingly. That memo was written in April of 2001. 5 months later, the terrorists flew commercial airliners into the World Trade Centers in the Pentagon, putting the U.S. and its allies into what would become the global war on terror. So all that I put out there just to say the future is not determined, and as Linton Wells put it, it will likely be very little like we expect. Focusing on our piece of the pie, on your piece of the pie, and pushing the envelope on change, finding the balances between what needs to change and what needs to stay, can ensure you stay ahead of the pace of disruption and helps to ensure our place remains at the world's greatest military institution. Thank you all for coming out today. God bless. Deo Presso Liber.